Chapters 40 through 43 of The Right of Way by Gilbert Parker. This recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss. Chapter 40. As It Was in the Beginning. The kitchen was empty, but light fell through the door of the shop opening upon the little hall between. Rosalie crossed the hall and stood in the doorway of the shop, a figure of concentrated indignation, despair, and shame. Leaning on his elbow, Charley was bending over a book in the light of a candle on the bench beside him. He was reading aloud, translating into English the German text of the narrative the Cure had given him. And because of this divine interposition, consequent upon their faithful prayers and their obligations, they did perform these holy scenes from season to season, with solemn proof of piety and godly living, so that it seemed the life of the Lord our Shepherd was ever present with them, as though indeed Oberammergau were Nazareth or Jerusalem. And the hearts of all in the land did answer daily to that sweet and lively faith, insomuch that even in times of war the zeal of the people became a holy zeal, and their warfare noble, so that they did accept both victory and defeat with equal humbleness. Because there was no war in their hearts, but peace, and they did fight to defend and not to acquire, they buried their foe with tears, and their own with singleness of heart and quiet joy, for that they did rest from their labours. In this manner was the great tragedy and glory of the world made to the people a present thing, transforming them to the body of the life that hath neither spot, nor blemish, nor— Charley had not heard Rosalie enter, nor her footsteps in the hall. But now there ran through his reading a thread of something not of himself or of it. He had thrilled to the archaic but clear-hearted style of the old German chronicler, and the warmth he felt had passed into his voice, so that it became louder. As Rosalie listened to his reading, 100 thoughts rushed through her mind. Paulette Dubois, the wanton woman, had just left his doorway secretly, yet there he was, instantly after, calmly reading a pious book. Her mind was in tumult. She could not reason, she could not rule her judgment. She only knew that the woman had come from this house and hurried guiltily away into the dark. She only knew that the man the woman had left here was the man she loved more than her life, for he embodied all her past, all her present. She knew that she could not live without him, all her future, for where he went she would go, whatever the fate. Her judgment had been swept from its moorings. She had been carried on the wave of her heart's fever into this room, not daring to think this or that, not planning this or that, not accusing, not reproaching, not shaming herself and him by black suspicion, but blindly, madly demanding to see him, to look into his eyes, to hear his voice, to know him, whatever he was, man, lover, or devil. She was a child woman, a child in her primitive feelings that threw aside all convention, because there was no wrong in her heart; a woman, because she was possessed by a jealousy which shamed and angered her, because its very existence put him on trial, condemned him. Her soul was the sport of emotions and passions stronger than herself, because the heritage, the instinct of all the race of women, the eternal predisposition. At the moment her will was not sufficient to rule them to obedience. She was in the first subservience to that power which feeds the streams of human history. As she now listened to Charley reading, a sudden revulsion of feeling came over her. Some note in his voice reassured her heart, if it needed reassuring. The quiet force of his presence stilled the tumult in her, so that her eyes could see without mist, her heart beat without agony. But every pulse in her was throbbing, every instinct was alive. Presently there rushed upon her the words that had rung in her ears and chimed in her heart at the rest of the flax beaters. Take all, dear love, thou art my life's defender. Speak to my soul, take life and love, take all. Feelings lying beneath the mad conflict of emotion which had sent her into this room in such unmaidenly fashion, feelings that were her deepest self, welled up. Her breath came hard and broken. As Charley read on, A breathing seemed to answer his own. It became quicker than his own. It pierced the stillness. It filled the room with feeling. It came calling to him out of the silence. He swung round and saw the girl in the doorway. "Rosalie!" he cried, and sprang to his feet. With the piteously pathetic cry, she flung herself on her knees beside the tailor's bench where he worked every day, and, burying her face in her arms as they rested on the bench, wept bitterly. "Rosalie," he said anxiously, leaning over her, "what is the matter? What has happened?" She wept more bitterly still. She made a despairing gesture. His hand touched her hair. He dropped on a knee beside her. "Oh, I am so ashamed, ashamed! I have been so wicked!" she murmured. "Rosalie, what has happened?" he urged gently. His own heart was beating hard, his own eyes were responding to hers. The new feelings alive in him, the forces his love had awakened, which last night had kept him sleepless and had been upon him like a dream all day, they were at height in him now. He knew not how to command them. "Rosalie, dearest, tell me all," he persisted. "I shall never. I have been oh, you will never forgive me," she said brokenly. "I knew it wasn't true, but I couldn't help it. I saw her the woman come from your house, and " "Hush! For God's sake, hush!" he broke in almost harshly. Then a better understanding came upon him, and it made him gentle with her. "Ah, Rosalie, you do not think but it was natural you should wish to see me. But as soon as I saw you I knew that " She broke down again and wept. "I will tell you about her, Rosalie." His fingers stroked her hair, and, bending over her, his face was near her hands. "No, no, tell me nothing. Oh, if you tell me " "She came to hear from me what she sought to have heard from the Notary. She has had great trouble the man, her child, and I have helped her told her." His face was so near now that his breath was on her hair. She suddenly raised her head and clasped his face in her hands. "I knew oh, I knew!" she wept, and her eyes drank his. "Rosalie, my life!" he cried, clasping her in his arms. The love that was in him, new born but half understood, poured itself out in broken words like her own. For him there was no outside world, no past, no Kathleen, no Billy, no suspicion nor infidelity, or unfaith, no fear of disaster, no terrors of the future. Life was now to him and to her. Nothing brooded behind, nothing lay before. The candle spluttered and burnt low in the socket. Chapter 41. It was Michaelmas Day. Not a cloud in the sky, and, ruling all, a sweet sun, liberal in warmth and eager in brightness as its distance from the northern world decreased. As Mrs. Flynn entered the door of the post office, she sang out to Maximilian Cour with a buoyant lilt, "Oh, isn't it the fun of the world to be alive!" The tailor over the way heard it, and lifted his head with a smile. Rosalie Evanturel, behind the postal wicket, heard it, and her face swam with colour. Rosalie busied herself with the letters and papers for a moment before she answered Mrs. Flynn's greeting, for there were ringing in her ears the words she herself had said a few days before: "It is good to live, isn't it?" To day it was so good to live that life seemed an endless being and a tireless happy doing, a gift of labour, an inspiring daytime, and a rejoicing sleep. Exaltation, a painful joy, and a wide embarrassing wonderment possessed her. She met Mrs. Flynn's face at the wicket with shining eyes and a timid smile. "Aye, there ye are, darlin'," said Mrs. Flynn. "And how's the dear father to day?" "He seems about the same, thank you." "Ah, that's foine. Shure, if we could always be about the same, we'd do. True for you, darlin', 'tis as you say. If old Mary Flynn could always be 'bout the same, the clods of the valley would never cover her bones. But there 'tis. We're here to day and away to morrow. Shure, though, I am not complainin'. Not I, not Mary Flynn. Terry Flynn used to say to me, says he, 'Never born to know distress, happy as worms in a garden of cucumbers. 17 years in this country, Mary,' says he, 'and never in the penitentiary yet. There ye are. Ah, the birds do be singin' to day. 'Tis good, darlin'. You'll not mind Mary Flynn callin' you darlin', though you are postmistress, and 'll be more than that wan day, or Mary Flynn's a fool. Ay, more than that you'll be, darlin', and your eyes like pearly brown topazes, and your cheeks like roses sure. Is there any leather for Mary Flynn, darlin'?" she hastily added, as she saw the Seigneur standing in the doorway. He had evidently been listening. "Ye didn't hear what your old fool of a cook was sayin'," she added to the Seigneur, as Rosalie shook her head and answered: "No letters, madame, dear." Rosalie timidly added the "dear," for there was something so great hearted in Mrs. Flynn that she longed to clasp her round the neck, longed as she had never done in her life to lay her head upon some motherly breast and pour out her heart. But it was not to be now. Secrecy was her duty still. "Can't ye speak to your old fool of a cook, sir?" Mrs. Flynn said again, as the Seigneur made way for her to leave the shop. "How did you guess?" he said to her in a low voice, his sharp eyes peering into hers. "By the looks in your face these past weeks, and the look in hers," she whispered, and went on her way rejoicing. "I'll wind them both round me finger like a wisp of straw," she said, going up the road with a light step, despite her weight, till she was stopped by the malicious grocerman of the village, whose tongue had been wagging for hours upon an unwholesome theme. Meanwhile, in the post office, the Seigneur and Rosalie were face to face. "It is Michaelmas day," he said. "May I speak with you, mademoiselle?" She looked at the clock. It was on the stroke of noon. The shop always closed from 12 till half past 12. "Will you step into the parlour, monsieur?" she said, and coming round the counter, locked the shop door. She was trembling and confused, and entered the little parlour shyly. Yet her eyes met the Seigneur's bravely. "Your father, how is he?" he said, offering her a chair. The sunlight streaming in the window made a sort of pathway of light between them, while they were in the shade. "He seems no worse, and to day he is wheeling himself about." "He is stronger, then. That's good. Is there any fear that he must go to the hospital again?" She inclined her head. "The doctor says he may have to go any moment. It may be his one chance. The Cure is very kind, and says that, with your permission, his sister will keep the office here if needed." The Seigneur nodded briskly. "Of course, of course. But have you not thought that we might secure another postmistress?" Her face clouded a little. Her heart beat hard. She knew what was coming. She dreaded it, but it was better to have it over now. "We could not live without it," she said helplessly. "What we have saved is not enough. The little my mother had must pay for the visits to the hospital. I have kept it for that. You see, I need the place here." "But you have thought just the same. Do you not know the day?" he asked meaningly. She was silent. "I have come to ask you to marry me. This is Michaelmas day, Rosalie." She did not speak. He had hopes for her silence. "If anything happened to your father, you could not live here alone, but a young girl. Your father may be in the hospital for a long time. You cannot afford that. If I were to offer you money, you would refuse. If you marry me, all that I have is yours, to dispose of at your will. To make others happy, to take you now and then from this narrow place to see what's going on in the world." "I am happy here," she said falteringly. "Chaudiere is the finest place in the world," he replied proudly, and as a matter of fact. "But, for the sake of knowledge, you should see what the rest of the world is. It helps you to understand Chaudiere better. I ask you to be my wife, Rosalie." She shook her head sorrowfully. "You said before it was not because I am old, not because I am rich, not because I am Seigneur, not because I am I, that you refused me." She smiled at him now. "That is true," she said. "Then what reason can you have?" "None, none. No, 'pon honour, I believe you are afraid of marriage because it's marriage. By my life, there's naught to dread. A little giving here and taking there, and it's easy. And when a woman is all that's good to a man, it can be done without fear or trembling. Even the Cure would tell you that." "Ah, I know," she said in a voice half painful, half joyous. "I know that it is so. But oh, dear Monsieur, I cannot marry you. Never. Never." He hung on bravely. "I want to make life easy and happy for you. I want the right to do so. When trouble comes upon you—" "When it does, I will turn to you. Ah, yes, I would turn to you without fear, dear Monsieur," she said, and her heart ached within her, for a premonition of sorrow came upon her and filled her eyes, and made her heart like lead within her breast. "I know how true a gentleman you are," she added. "I could give you everything but that which is life to me, which is being and soul, and the beginning and the end." The weight of the revealing hour of her life, its wonder, its agony, its irrevocability, was upon her. It was giving new meanings to existence, primitive woman, child of nature as she was. All morning she had longed to go out into the woods and bury herself among the ferns and bracken, and laugh and weep for very excess of feeling, downright joy and vague woe possessing her at once. She looked the Seigneur in the eyes with consuming earnestness. "Oh, it is not because I am young," she said in a low voice, "for I am old. Indeed, I am very old. It is because I cannot love you, and never can love you in the one great way. And I will not marry without love. My heart is fixed on that. When I marry, it will be when I love a man so much that I cannot live without him. If he is so poor that each meal is a miracle, it will make no difference. Oh, can't you see, can't you feel what I mean, Monsieur? You who are so wise and learned, and know the world so well." "Wise and learned," he said a little roughly, for his voice was husky with emotion. "'Pon honour, I think I am a fool. A bewildered fool that knows no more of woman than my cook knows Sanskrit. Faith, 100 times less. For Mary Flynn's got an eye to see, and without telling, she knew I had a mind set on you. But Mary Flynn thought more than that, for she has an idea that you've a mind set on some one, Rosalie. She thought it might be me." "A woman is not so easily read as a man," she replied, half smiling, but with her eyes turned to the street. A few people were gathering in front of the house. She wondered why. "There is some one else, that is it, Rosalie. There is some one else. You shall tell me who it is. You shall." He stopped short, for there was a loud knocking at the shop door, and the voice of M. Evanturel calling, "Rosalie! Rosalie! Rosalie! Ah, come quickly! Ah, my Rosalie!" Without a look at the Seigneur, Rosalie rushed into the shop and opened the front door. Her father was deathly pale and was trembling violently. "Rosalie, my bird!" he cried indignantly. "They're saying you stole the cross from the church door." He was now wheeled inside the shop, and people gathered round, looking at him and Rosalie, some covertly, some as friends, some in a half frightened way, as though strange things were about to happen. "Shure 'tis a lie, or me name's not Mary Flynn, the darlin'," said the Seigneur's cook with blazing face. "Who makes this charge?" roared an angry voice. No one had seen the Seigneur enter from the little room beside the shop, and at the sound of the sharp voice the people fell back, for he was as free with his stick as his tongue. "I do," said the grocer, to whom Paulette Dubois had told her story. "Ye shall be tarred and feathered before ye are a day older," said Mary Flynn. Rosalie was very pale. The Seigneur was struck by this, and by the strangeness of her look. "Clear the room," he said to Filion Lacasse, who was now a constable of the parish. "Not yet," said a voice at the doorway. "What is the trouble?" It was the Cure, who had already heard rumours of the scandal, and had come at once to Rosalie. M. Evanturel tried to speak, and could not. But Mary Flynn did, with a face like a piece of scarlet bunting. Having finished with a flourish, she could scarce keep her hands off the cowardly grocer. The Cure turned to Rosalie. "It is absurd," he said. "Forgive me," he added to the Seigneur. "It is better that Rosalie should answer this charge. If she gives her word of honour, I will deny communion to whoever slanders her hereafter." "She did it," said the grocer stubbornly. "She can't deny it." "Answer, Rosalie," said the Cure firmly. "Excuse me, I will answer," said a voice at the door. The tailor of Chaudiere made his way into the shop, through the fast gathering crowd. Chapter 42. A Trial and a Verdict. "What right have you to answer for mademoiselle?" said the Seigneur with a sudden rush of jealousy. Was not he alone the protector of Rosalie Evanturel? Yet here was mystery, and it was clear the tailor had something important to say. And Rossignol offered the Cure a chair, seated himself on a small bench, and gently drew Rosalie down beside him. "I will make this a court," said he. "Advance, grocer." The grocer came forward smugly. "On what information do you make this charge against mademoiselle?" The grocer volubly related all that Paulette Dubois had said. As he told his tale the Cure's face was a study, for the night the cross was restored came back to him, and the events, so far as he knew them, was in keeping with the grocer's narrative. He looked at Rosalie anxiously. Monsieur Evanturel moaned, for he remembered he had heard Rosalie come in very late that night. Yet he fixed his eyes on her in dog-like faith. "Mademoiselle will admit that this is true, I presume," said Charley. Rosalie looked at him intently, as though to read his very heart. It was clear that he wished her to say yes, and what he wished was law. "It is quite true," answered Rosalie calmly, and all fear passed from her. "But she did not steal the cross," continued Charley in a louder voice, that all might hear, for people were gathering fast. "If she didn't steal it, why was she putting it back on the church door in the dark?" said the grocer. "Ah, hold your head, old sand in the sugar," said Mrs. Flynn, her fingers aching to get into his hair. "Silence!" said the Seigneur severely, and looked inquiringly at Rosalie. Rosalie looked at Charley. "It is not a question of why mademoiselle put the cross back," he said. "It is a question of who took the cross away, is it not? Suppose it was not a theft. Suppose that the person who took the relic thought to do a pious act for your church, Monsieur." "I do not see," the Cure answered helplessly. "It was a secret act, therefore suspicious at least." "Let your good gifts be in secret, and your heavenly Father who seeth in secret will reward you openly," answered Charley. "That, I believe, is a principle you teach, Monsieur." "At one time Monsieur the tailor was thought to have taken the cross," said the Seigneur suggestively. "Perhaps Monsieur was secretly doing good with it?" he added. It vexed him that there should be a secret between Rosalie and this man. "It had to do with me, not I with it," he answered evenly. He must travel wide at first to convince their narrow brains. "Mademoiselle did a kind act when she nailed that cross on the church door again, to make a dead man rest easier in his grave." A hush fell upon the crowd. Rosalie looked at Charley in surprise. But she saw his meaning presently, that what she did for him must seem to have been done for the dead tailor only. Her heart beat hot with indignation, for she would, if she but might, cry her love gladly from the hilltops of the world. A light began to break upon the Cure's mind. "Will Monsieur speak plainly?" he said. "I did not see Louis Trudel take the cross, but I know that he did." "Louis Trudel! Louis Trudel!" interposed the Seigneur anxiously. "What does this mean?" "Monsieur speaks the truth," interposed Rosalie. The Cure recalled the deathbed of Louis Trudel, and the dying man's strange agitation. He also recalled old Margot's death, and her wish to confess some one else's wrong doing. He was convinced that Charley was speaking the truth. "It is true," added Charley slowly. "But you may think none the worse of him when you know all. He took the cross for temporary use, and before he could replace it, he died." "How do you know what he meant and did not mean?" said the Seigneur in perplexity. "Did he take you into his confidence?" "The very closest," answered Charley grimly. "Yet he looked upon you as an infidel, and said hard things of you on his deathbed," urged the Cure anxiously. "He could not see the end of the tale, and he was troubled for both the dead man and the living. That was why he took me into his confidence. I will explain. I have not the honour to have the fulness of your Christian faith, Monsieur le Cure. I had asked him to show me a sign from heaven, and he showed it by the little cross." "I can't make anything of that," said the Seigneur peevishly. Rosalie sprang to her feet. "He would not tell the whole truth, Messieurs, but I will. With that little cross Louis Trudel would have killed Monsieur, had it not been for me." A gasp of excitement went out from those who stood by.
"But for you, Rosalie?" asked the Cure. "But for me. I saw Louis Trudel raise an iron against Monsieur that day in the shop. It made me nervous. I thought he was mad. So I watched. That night I saw a light in the tailor's shop late. I thought it strange. I went over and peeped through the cracks of the shutters. I saw old Louis at the fire, with the little cross red hot. I knew he meant trouble. I ran into the house. Old Margot was beside herself with fear. She had seen also. I ran through the hall and saw old Louis upstairs with the burning cross. I followed. He went into Monsieur's room. When I got to the door—" She paused, trembling, for she saw Charley's reproving eyes upon her. "I saw him with the cross raised over Monsieur." "He meant to threaten me," interposed Charley quickly. "We will have the truth," said the Seigneur in a husky voice. "The cross came down on Monsieur's bare breast." The grocer laughed vindictively. "Silence!" growled the Seigneur. "Silence!" said Filion Lacasse, and dropped his hand on the grocer's shoulder. "I'll baste you with the stirrup strap." "The rest is well known," quickly interposed Charley. "The poor old man was mad. He thought it a pious act to mark an infidel with the cross." Every eye was fixed upon him. The Cure remembered Louis Trudel's last words. "Look, look! I gave him the sign of—" Old Margot's words also kept ringing in his ears. He turned to the Seigneur. "Monsieur," said he, "we have heard the truth. That act of Louis Trudel was cruel and murderous. May God forgive him! I will not say that mademoiselle did well in keeping silent." "God bless the darlin'!" cried Mrs. Flynn. "But I will say that she meant to do a kind act for a man's mortal memory, perhaps at the expense of his soul." "For Monsieur to take his injury in silence, to keep it secret, was kind," said the Seigneur. "It is what our Cure here might call bearing his cross manfully." "Seigneur," said the Cure reproachfully. "Seigneur, it is no subject for jest." "Cure, our tailor here has treated it as a jest." "Let him show his breast if it's true," said the grocer, who beneath his smirking was a malignant soul. The Cure turned on him sharply. Seldom had any one seen the Cure roused. "Who are you, Baptiste Maxime, that your base curiosity should be satisfied? You, whose shameless tongue clattered, whose foolish soul rejoiced over the scandal. Must we all wear the facts of our lives, our joys, our sorrows, and our sins, for such eyes as yours to read? Bethink you of the evil things that you would hide. Ah, every one here," he added loudly, "know, all of you, what goodness of heart towards a wicked man lay behind the secret these two have kept, that old Margot carried to her grave. When you go to your homes, pray for as much human kindness as you, as a man of no church or faith can show. For this child," he turned to Rosalie, "honor her. Go now. Go in peace." "One moment," said the Seigneur. "I fine Baptiste Maxime $20 for defamation of character, the money to go for the poor." "You hear that, old sand in the sugar?" said Mrs. Flynn. "Will you let me kiss ye, darlin'?" she added to Rosalie, and waddling over, reached out her hands. Rosalie's eyes were wet as she warmly kissed the old Irishwoman, and thereupon they entered into a friendship which was without end. The Seigneur drove the crowd from the shop, and shut the door. The Cure came to Charley. "Monsieur," said he, "I have no words. When I remember what agonies you suffered in those hours, how bravely you endured them, ah, Monsieur," he added, with moist eyes, "I shall always feel that you are not far from the kingdom of God." A silence fell upon them, for the Cure, the Seigneur, and Rosalie, as they looked at Charley, thought of the scar like a red cross on his breast. It touched Charley with a kind of awe. He smiled painfully. "Shall I give you proof?" he said, making a motion to undo his waistcoat. "Monsieur!" said the Seigneur reprovingly, and holding out his hand. "Monsieur, we are all gentlemen." Chapter 42. Chapter 43. Jo Portugais tells a story. Walking slowly, head bent, eyes on seeing, Charley was on his way to Vadrome Mountain with the knowledge that Jo Portugais had returned. The hunger for companionship was on him, to touch some mind that could understand the deep loneliness which had settled on him since that scene in the post office. It was the loneliness of a new and great separation. He had wakened to it to day. Once before, in the hut on Vadrome Mountain, he had wakened from a grave, had been born again. Last night had come still another birth, had come, as with Rosalie herself, knowledge, revelation, understanding. To Rosalie the new vision had come with a vague pain of heart, without shame, and with a wonderful happiness. Pain, shame, knowledge, and a happiness that passed suddenly into a despairing sorrow had come to him. In finding love he had found conscience, and in finding conscience he was on his way to another great discovery. Looking to where Jo Portugais' house was set among the pines, Charley remembered the day. He saw the scene in his mind's eye, when Rosalie entered with the letter addressed to the sick man at the house of Jo Portugais at Vadrome Mountain, and he saw again her clear, unsoiled soul in the deep, inquiring eyes. If you but knew, he turned and looked down at the village below. If you but knew, he said, as though to all the world. I have the sign from heaven. I know it now. Today I wake to know what life means, and I see, Rosalie I know now. But how? In taking all she had to give. What does she get in return? Nothing. Nothing. Because I love her, because the whole world is nothing beside her, nor life, nor 20 lives, if I had them to give, I must say to her now, Rosalie, it was love that brought you to my arms. It is love that says, thus far, and no farther. Never again, never, never, never! Yesterday I could have left her, died or vanished, without real hurt to her. She would have mourned and broken her heart and mended it again, and I should have been only a memory, of mystery, of tenderness. Then, one day, she would have married, and no sting from my going would have remained. She would have had happiness, and I neither shame nor despair. Today it is all too late. We have drunk too deep, alas, too deep. She cannot marry another man, for ghosts will not lie for asking, and what is mine may not be another's. She cannot marry me, for what was once mine is mine still by ring and by book, and I should always be haunted by a torturing shadow. Kathleen has the right of way, not Rosalie. Ah, Rosalie, I dare not wrong you any further. Yet to marry you, even as things are, if that might be! To live on here, unrecognized! I am little like my old self, and year after year I should grow less and less like Charley Steele. But no, it is not possible. He stopped short in his thoughts, and his lips tightened in bitterness. God in heaven, what an impasse! He said aloud. There was a sudden cracking of twigs, as a man rose up from a log by the wayside ahead of him. It was Jo Portugais, who had seen him coming, and had waited for him. He had heard Charley's words. "Do you call me an impasse, M'sieu'?" Charley grasped Portugais' hand. "What has happened, M'sieu'?" Jo asked anxiously. There was a brief silence, and then Charley told him of the events of the morning. "You know of the mark here?" he asked, touching his breast. Jo nodded. "I saw when you were ill." "Yet you never asked." "I studied it out. I knew old Louis Trudel. Also, I saw Ma'm'selle nail the cross to the church door. 2 and 2 together in my mind did it. I didn't think Paulette Dubois would tell. I warned her." "She quarrelled with Mademoiselle. It was revenge. She might have been less vindictive. She had had good luck herself lately." "What good luck had she, M'sieu'?" Charley told Jo the story of the Notary, the woman, and the child. Jo made no comment. They relapsed into silence. Arriving at the house, they entered. Jo lighted his pipe, and smoked steadily for a time without speaking. Buried in thought, Charley stood in the doorway, looking down at the village. At last he turned. "Where have you been these weeks past, Jo?" "To Quebec first, M'sieu'." Charley looked curiously at Jo, for there was meaning in his tone. "And where last?" "To Montreal." Charley's face became paler, his hands suddenly clinched, for he read the look in Jo's eyes. He knew that Jo had been looking at people and places once so familiar, that he had seen Kathleen. "Go on, tell me all,"
he said heavily. Portugais spoke in English. The foreign language seemed to make the truth less naked and staring to himself. He had a hard story to tell. "It is not to say why I go to Montreal," he began, "but I go. I have my ears open, my eyes she is not close. No one knows me, I am no account of. Every one is forgot the man Joseph Nadeau, who is try for his life. Perhaps it is every one is forget the lawyer who save his neck, perhaps? So I stand by the street side. I say to a man as I look up at signboards, 'Where is that writing M'sieu' Charles Steele, and all the rest?' 'He is dead long ago,' say the man to me. A good thing too, for he was the very devil. 'I not understand,' I say. 'I tink that M'sieu' Steele is a damn smart man back time.' 'He was the smartest man in the country, that Beauty Steele,' the man say. 'He bamboozle the jury every time. He cut up bad, though.'" Charley raised his hand with a nervous gesture of misery and impatience. "Where have you been?" that man say. "Where have you been all these times not to know 'bout Charley Steele, hein?" "In the backwoods," I say. "What bring you here now?" he asked. "I have a case," I say. "What is it?" he asked. "It is a case of a man who is punish for another man," I say. "That's the thing for Charley Steele," he laughed. "He was a great man to root things out. Can't fool Charley Steele, we used to say here. But he die a bad death." "What was the matter with him?" I say. "He drink too much, he spend too much, he run after a girl at Cote Dorion, and the river drivers do for him one night. They say it was accident, but it is more than any green on my eye. But he die trump, just like him. He have no fear of devil or man, so the man say." "But fear of God?" I asked. "He was hinfidel," he say. "That was behin' all, he was crooked all round. He rob the widow and horphan. I think he too smart for that. I speak quick. I suppose it was the drink," he say. "He lose his grip. He was a smart man, and he would make you all sit up if he come back," I answer. "If he come back?" The man laugh queer at that. "If he come back, there would be hell." "How is that?" I say. "Look across the street," he whisper. That was his wife. Charley choked back a cry in his throat. Joe had no intention of cutting his story short. He had an end in view. "I look across the street. There she is. Ah, that is a fine woman to see. I have never seen but one more finer to look at, here in Chaudiere. The man say, she marry first for money, and break her heart. Now she marry for love. If Beauty Steele come back, sacre! That would be a mess. But he is at the bottom of the St. Lawrence, the courts say so, and the church say so, and ghosts don't walk here. But if that Beauty Steele come back alive, what would happen it?" I speak. "His wife is marry, blockhead," he say. "But this woman is his," I answer. "Don't you think she would go back to a thief she never love from the man she love?" He speak back. "She is not married to the other man," I say, "if Beauty Steele is. He is dead as a door, he swear. You see that?" He go on, nodding down the street. "Well, that is Billy." "Who is Billy?" I ask. "The brother of her," he say. Charley he spoil Billy. Billy he has not been the same since Charley's death, he is so ashame of Charley. When he get drunk, he talk of nothing else. We all remember that Charley spoil him, and that makes us sorry for him. Excuse me, I say. I think that Billy is a damn smart man. He is smart as Charley Steele." "Charley was the smartest man in the country," he say again. "I've got his practice now. But this town will never be the same without him. Thief or no thief, I wish he is alive here. By the Lord, I'd get drunk with him. He was all right, that man," Joe added finally. Charley's agitation was hidden. His eyes were fixed on Joe intently. "That was Larry Rockwell. Go on," he said in a hard metallic voice. "I see her the next night again. It is in the white stone house on the hill. All the windows are open, and I can hear her to sing. I know not that song. It begin, 'Oft in the stilly night,' like that." Charley stiffened. It was the song Kathleen sang for him the night they became engaged. It is a good voice, that. I see her face, for there is a candle on the piano. I come close and closer to the house. There is big maple trees. I am well hid. A man is beside her. He lean over her and put his hand on her shoulder.
"Sing it again, Kathleen," he say. "I cannot to get enough." "Stop!" said Charley in a strained, harsh voice. "Not yet, M'sieu'," said Portugais. "It is good for you to hear what I say." "Come, Kathleen," the man say, and he blow out the candle. I hear them walk away, and the door shut behind them. Then I hear another voice. Ah, that is a baby, very young baby. Charley quickly got to his feet. "Not another word!" he said. "Yes, yes, but there is one word more, M'sieu'," said Jo, standing up and facing him firmly. "You must go back. You are not a thief. The woman is yours. You throw your life away. What is the man to you, or the man's brat of a child? It is all waiting for you. You must go back. You not steal the money, but that Billy, it is that Billy, I know. You can forgive your wife, and take her back, or you can say to both, go. You can put everything right, and begin again." Anger, wild words, seemed about to break from Charley's lips, but he conquered himself. The old life had been brought back to him with painful acuteness and vividness. The streets of the town, the people in the street, Billy, the mean scoundrel, who could not leave him alone in the grave of obscurity, Kathleen, Fairing. The voice of the child, with her voice, was in his ears. A child! If he had had a child, perhaps. He stopped short in his thinking, his face all at once flooding with colour. For a moment he stood looking out of the window down towards the village. He could see the post office like a toy house among toy houses. At last he turned to Jo. "Never again while I live speak of this to me. Of the past, of going back, or of anything else," he said. "I cannot go back. I am dead and shamed. Let the dust of forgetfulness come and cover the past. I've begun life again here, and here I stay, and see it out. I shall work out the problem here." He dropped a hand on the other's shoulder. "Jo," said he, "we are both shipwrecks. Let us see how long we can float." "M'sieu', is it worth it?" said Portugais, remembering his confession to the Abbe, and seeing the end of it all to himself. "I don't know, Jo. Let us wait and see how fate will play us." "Or God, M'sieu'?" "God or fate, who knows?" Chapter 43. Recording by Tom Weiss. Tom'sAudiobooks.com. Chapters 44 through 46 of The Right Away by Gilbert Parker. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss. Chapter 44. Who was Kathleen? The painful incidents of the morning weighed heavily upon Rosalie, and she was glad when Madame Dugal came to talk with her father, who was ailing and irritable, and when Mrs. Flynn drove her away with a kiss on either cheek, saying, "Don't come back, darlin', till there's roses in both cheeks, for your eyes are eatin' up your face." She had seen Charley take the path to Vadrome Mountain, and to the rest of the flax beaters she betook herself, in the blind hope that, returning, he might pass that way. Under the influence of the fresh air and the quiet of the woods her spirits rose, her pulse beat faster, though a sense of foreboding and sorrow hovered round her. The 2 miles' walk to her beloved retreat seemed a matter of minutes only, so busy were her thoughts. Her mind was one luxurious confusion, through which travelled a ghostly little sprite, who kept tumbling her thoughts about, sneering, smirking, whispering, "You dare not go to confession. Dare not go to confession. You will never be the same again, never feel the same again, never think the same again. Your dreams are done. You can only love. And what will this do for you? What do you expect to happen? You dare not go to confession." Her reply had been the one iteration: "I love him. I love him. I love him. We shall be together all our lives, till we are old and grey. I shall watch him at his work, and listen to his voice. I shall read with him and walk with him, and I shall grow to think like him a little, in everything except religion, in everything except that. One day he will come to think like me, to believe in God."
In the dreamy happiness of these thoughts, the colour came to her cheeks, the roses of light gathered in her eyes. In her tremulous ardour she scarcely realized how time had passed, and her reverie deepened as the afternoon shadows grew and the sun made to its covert behind the hills. She was roused by a man's voice singing just under the bluff where she sat. To her this voice represented the battle call, the home call, the life call of the universe. The song it sang was known to her. It was as old as Rizzio. It had come from old France with Mary, had been merged into English words and English music, and had voyaged to New France. There it had been sung by lovers in fair vales, on wide rivers, and in deep forests. What is not mine I may not hold. Ah, hark the hunter's horn! And what is thine may not be sold. My love comes through the corn. And none shall buy, and none shall sell. What, love works well? In the walk back from Vadrome Mountain, a change, a fleeting change, had passed over Charley's mind and mood. The quiet of the woodland, the song of the birds, the tumbling brook, the smell of the rich earth, replenishing its strength from the gorgeous falling leaves, had soothed him. Thoughts of Rosalie took a new form. Her image possessed him, excluding the future, the perils that surrounded him. He had gone through so much within the past 24 hours that the capacity for suffering had almost exhausted itself, and in the reaction, endearing thoughts of Rosalie had dominion over him. It was the reassertion of primitive man, the demands of the first element. The great problem was still in the background. The picture of Kathleen and the other man was pushed into the distance. Thoughts of Billy and his infamy were thrust underfoot. How futile to think of them! There was Rosalie to be thought of, the to-day and to-morrow of the new life. Rosalie was of to-day. How strong and womanly she had been this morning, a girl whose life had been bounded by this Chaudiere, with a metropolitan convent and hospital as her only glimpses of the busy world. She would fit in anywhere, in the highest places, with her grace and her nobleness of mind Arcadian, passionate, and beautiful. There came upon him again the feeling of the evening before, when he saw her standing in his doorway, the night about them, jealous affection, undying love, in her eyes. It quickened his steps imperceptibly. He passed the stream and glanced down into a dark pool involuntarily. It reflected himself clearly. He stopped short. "Is this you, Beauty Steele?" he said, and he caught his brown beard in his hand. Beauty Steele had brains and no heart. You have heart, and your wits have gone wool gathering. No matter. What is not mine I may not hold. Ah, hark the hunter's horn, he sang, and came quickly along the stream where the flax beaters worked in harvest time, then up the hill, then Rosalie. She started to her feet. "I knew you would come. I knew you would," she said. "You have been waiting here for me?" he asked breathless, taking her hand. "I felt you would come. I made you," she added, smiling, and eagerly answering the look in his eyes, threw her arms round his neck. In that moment's joy a fresh realization of their fate came upon him with dire force, and a bitter protest went up from his heart that he and she should be sacrificed. Yet the impasse was there, and what could remove it? What clear the way? He looked down at the girl whose head was buried in happy peace on his shoulder. She clung to him, as though in him was everlasting protection from the sprite that kept whispering, "You dare not go to confession. Your dreams are done. You can only love." But she had no fear now. As he looked down at her, a swift change passed over him, and, almost for the first time since he was a little child, his eyes filled with tears. He hastily brushed them away, and drew her down on the seat beside him. He was wondering how he should tell her that they must not meet like this, that they must be apart. No matter what had happened, no matter what love there was, it was better that they should die, that he should die, than that they should meet like this. There was only one end to secret meetings, and discovery was inevitable. Then, with discovery, shame to her. For he must either marry her, how could he marry her? Or die.
For him to die would but increase her misery. The time had passed when it could be of any use. It passed that day in the hut on Vadrome Mountain, when she said that if he died, she would die with him. "Where you are going you will be alone. There will be no one to care for you, no one but me." Last night it passed forever. She had put her life into his hands. Henceforth there could never be a question of giving or taking, of withdrawing or advancing, for all was irrevocable, sealed with the Great Seal. Yet she must be saved. But how? She suddenly looked up at him. "I can ask you anything I want now, can't I?" she said. "Anything, Rosalie." "You know that when I ask, it is because I want to know what you know, so that I may feel as you feel. You know that, don't you?" "I know it when you tell me, wonderful Rosalie." What a revelation it was, this transmuting power which could change mortal dross into the coin of immortal wealth. "I want to ask you," she said, "who was Kathleen?" His blood seemed to go cold in his veins, and he sat without answering, shocked and dismayed. What could she know of Kathleen? "Can't you tell me?" she asked anxiously yet fearfully. He looked so strange that she thought she had offended him. "Please don't mind telling me. I should understand everything everything. Was it some one you loved once?" It was hard for her to say it, but she said it bravely. "No, I never loved any one in all the world, Rosalie. Not till I loved you." She gave a happy sigh. "Oh, it is wonderful!" she said. "It is wonderful and good. Did you love me from the very first?" "I think I did, though I didn't know it from the very first," he answered slowly. His heart beat hard, for he could not guess how she should know of Kathleen. It was absurdly impossible that she should know. "But many have loved you," she said proudly. "They have not shown it." "They have not shown it," he answered grimly, then added quickly and with aching anxiety, "When did you hear of Kathleen?" "Oh, you are such a blind huntsman," she laughed. "Don't you know where my little fox was hiding? Why, in the shop, when you held the note paper up to the light, and looked startled, and bought all the paper we had that was watermarked Kathleen. Do you think that was clever of me? I don't." "I think it was very clever," he said. "Then she, Kathleen, doesn't really matter?" she asked eagerly. "Of course she can't, if you don't love her. But does she love you? Did she ever love you?" "Never in her life." "So of course it doesn't matter," she rejoined. "Hush!" she added rapidly. "I see some one coming in the trees yonder. It may be some one for me. Father knows I come here sometimes. Go quickly and hide behind the rocks, please. I'll stay and see who it is. Please go, dearest." He kissed her, and keeping out of sight, got to a place of safety a few hundred feet away. He saw the newcomer run to Rosalie, speak to her, saw Rosalie half turn in his own direction, then go hastily down the hillside with the messenger. "It is her father!" he exclaimed, and followed at a distance. At the village he learned that M. Evanturel had had another seizure. Chapter 45. 6 months go by. Spring again. Budding trees and flowing sap. The earth banks removed from the houses, and outside windows discarded. The ice tumbling and crunching in the river. The dormant farmer raising his head to the energy and delight of April. The winter had been long and hard. Never had there been severer frost or deeper snow, and seldom had big game been so plentiful. In the snug warm stables the cattle munched and chewed the cud, the idle long-haired horses grew as spirited in the keen air as in summer they were sluggish with hard work, and the farm hands were abroad in the dark of the early mornings with lanterns, to feed the stock and take them out to water, singing cheerfully. All morning spread the clamour of the flail and the fanning mill, the swish of the knife through the turnips and the beets, and the sound of the saw and the axe, as the youngest man of the family, muffled to the nose, sawed the wood into lengths or split the knots. Night brought the cutting and stringing of apples, the shelling of the Indian corn, the making of rag carpets. On Saturday came the going to market with grain, or pork, or beef, or fowls frozen like stones, the gossip in the market place. Then again sounded jingling sleigh bells as, on the return road, the habitant made for home, a glass of white whiskey inside him, and black-eyed children in the doorway, swarming like bees at the mouth of a hive. This particular winter in Chaudiere had been full of excitement and expectation. At Easter time there was to be the great Passion Play, after the manner of that known as the Passion Play of Ober Ammergau. Not one in 100 habitants had ever heard of Ober Ammergau, but they had all shared in picturesque processions of the Stations of the Cross to some calvaire, and many had taken part in dramatic scenes arranged from the life of Christ. Drama of a crude kind was deep in them, it showed in gesture, speech, and temperament. In all the preparations Maximilian Cour was a conspicuous and useful official. Gifted with a dramatic temperament to a degree rare in so humble a man, it was he who really educated the people of Chaudiere in the details of the Passion Play to be produced by the good Catholics of the parish and the Indians of the reservation. He had gone to the Cure every day, and the Cure had talked with him, and then had sent him to the tailor, who had, during the past 6 months, withdrawn more and more from the life about him, practically living with shut door. No one ventured in unless on business, or were in need, or wished advice. These he never turned empty away. Besides Portugais, Maximilian Cour was the one man received constantly by the tailor. With patience and insight, Charley taught the baker, by drawings and careful explanations, the outlines of the representation, and the baker grew proud of the association, though Charley's face used to haunt him in his sleep. Excitable, eager, there was an elemental adaptability in the baker, as easily leading to Avernus as to Elysium. This appealed to Charley, realizing, as he did, that Maximilian Cour was a reputable citizen by mere accident. The baker's life had run in a sentimental groove of religious duty. That same sentimentality would, in other circumstances, have forced him with equal ardour into the broad primrose path. In the evening hours and on Sunday, Charley had worked at his drawings for the scenery and costumes of the play, and completed his translation of the German text, but there had been days when he could not put pen to paper. Life to him now was one aching emptiness, since that day at the Rest of the Flax beaters, Rosalie had been absent. On the very morning after their meeting by the river, she had gone away with her father to the great hospital at Montreal, not Quebec this time, on the advice of the Seigneur, as the one chance of prolonging his life. There had come but one letter from her since that hour when he saw her in the Seigneur's coach with her father, moving away in the still autumn air, a piteous appeal in her eyes. The good-bye look she gave him then was with him day and night. She had written one letter, and he had written one in reply, and no more. Though he was wholly reckless for himself, for her he was prudent now. There was nothing else to do. To save her, if he could but save her from himself. If he might only put back the clock. In his letter to her he had simply said that it were wiser not to write, since the acting postmistress, the Cure's sister, would note the exchange of letters, and this would arouse suspicion. He could not see what was best to do, what was right to do. To wait seemed the only thing, and his one letter ended with the words, "Rosalie, my life is lived only in the thought of you. There is no hour but I think of you, no moment but you are with me. The greatest proof of love that a man can give, I will give to you in the hour fate wills for us. But now we must wait. We must wait, Rosalie. Do not write to me, but know that if I could go to you, I would go. If I could say to you, 'Come,' I would say it. If the giving of my life would save you any pain or any sorrow, I would give it." Sitting on his bench at work, it seemed to Charley that sometimes she was near him, and more than once he turned quickly round as though she were, in very truth, standing beside him. He thought of her continually, and often with an unbearable pain. He figured her in his mind as pale and distressed, and always her eyes had the piteous terror of that last look as she went away over the hills. But the weeks had worn on, then the Seigneur, who had been to Montreal, came back with the news that Rosalie was looking as beautiful as a picture. Grown a woman in beauty and in stature, comely, comely as a lady in a Watteau picture, my dear messieurs, he had said to the Cure, standing in the tailor's shop. Replying, the Cure had said, "She is in good hands with good people, recommended to me by an abbe there. Yet I am not wholly happy about her. When her trouble comes to her," Charley's needle slipped and pierced his finger to the bone, "when her father goes, as he must, I fear, there will be no familiar face, she will hear no familiar voice." "Faith, there you are very wrong, my dear Cure," answered the Seigneur. "There'll be a face yonder she likes very well indeed, and a voice she's fond of too." Charley's back was on them at that moment, of which he was glad, for his face was haggard with anxiety, and it seemed hours before the Cure spoke. "Whom do you mean, Maurice?" And hours before the Seigneur replied, "Mrs. Flynn, of course. I'm sending her to morrow." Mrs. Flynn had gone, and Charley had, in one sense, been made no happier by that, for it seemed to him that Rosalie would rather that strangers' eyes were on her than the inquisitively friendly eye of Mary Flynn. Weeks had grown into months, and no news came, none save that which the Cure let fall, or was brought by the irresponsible Notary, who heard all gossip. Only the Cure's scant news were authentic, however, and Charley never saw the good priest but he had a secret hope of hearing him say that Rosalie was coming back. Yet when she came back, what would or could he do? There was always the crime for which he or Billy must be punished. Concerning this crime his heart was growing harder, for Rosalie's sake. But there was Kathleen. And Rosalie was now in the city where she lived, and they might meet. There was one solution, if Kathleen should die. It sickened him that he could think of that with a sense of relief, almost of hope. If Kathleen should die, then he would be free to marry Rosalie. Into what? He still could only marry her into the peril and menace of the law. Again, even if Kathleen did not stand in the way, neither the Cure nor any other priest would marry him to her without his antecedents being certified. A Protestant minister would perhaps, but would Rosalie give up her faith? Following him without the blessing of the Church, she would trample underfoot every dear tradition of her life, win the scorn of all of her religion, and destroy her own peace. For the faith of her fathers was as the breath of her nostrils. What cruelty to her! But was it, after all, even true that he had but to call, and she would come? In truth, it well might be that she had learned to despise him, to feel how dastardly he had been to take her love, given in blind simplicity, bestowed like the song of the bird upon the listening fields, to take the plenteous fulness of her life, and give nothing in return save the empty hand, the hopeless hour, the secret sorrow. Nothing could quench his misery. The physical part of him craved without ceasing for something to allay his distress. Again and again he fought his old enemy with desperate resolve. To fall again, to touch liquor once more, was to end all for ever. He fought on tenaciously and gloomily, with little of the pride of life, with nothing of the old stubborn self-will, but with a new awakened sense. He had found conscience at last, and more. The months went by, and still M. Evanturel lingered on, and Rosalie did not come. The strain became too great at last. In the week preceding Easter, when all the parish was busy at Four Mountains, making costumes, rehearsing, building, putting up seats, cutting down trees, and erecting crosses and Calvaries, Charley disclosed to Jo a new intention. In the earlier part of the winter, Jo and he had met 2 or 3 times a week, but now Jo had come to help him with his work in the shop, 2 silent, devoted companions. They understood each other, and in that understanding were life and death. For never did Jo forget that a year from the day he had confessed his sins, he meant to give himself up to justice. This caused him no sleepless nights. He thought more of Charley than of himself, and every month now he went to confession, and every day he said his prayers. He was at his prayers when Charley went to tell him of his purpose. Charley had often seen Jo on his knees of late, and he had wondered, but not with the old pagan mind. "Jo," he said, "I am going away to Montreal." "To Montreal!" exclaimed Jo huskily. "You are going back to stay?" "Not that. I am going to see Rosalie Evanturel." Jo was troubled, but not dumbfounded. It had slowly crept into his mind that Charley loved the girl, though he had had no real ground for suspicion. His will, however, had been so long the slave of the other man's that he had far off reflections of his thoughts. He made no reply in words, but nodded his head. "I want you to stay here, Jo. If I don't come back and she does, stand by her, Jo. I can trust you." "You will come back, M'sieu', but you will come back, then?" Jo asked heavily. "If I can, Jo. If I can," he answered. Long after he had gone, Jo wandered up and down among the trees on the river road, up which Charley had disappeared with Jo's dogs and sled. He kept shaking his head mournfully. Chapter 46. The Forgotten Man. It was Easter morning, and the good sunrise of a perfect spring made radiant the high hill above the town. Rosy fingered morn touched with magic colour the masts and scattered sails of the ships upon the great river, and spires and towers quivered with rainbow light. The city was waking cheerfully, though the only active life was in the pealing bells and on the deep flowing rivers. The streets were empty yet, save for an assiduous priest or the cart of a milkman. Here and there a window opened, and a drowsy head was thrust into the eager air. These saw a bearded countryman, with his team of 6 dogs and his little cart, going slowly up the street. It was plain the man had come a long distance, from the mountains in the east or south, no doubt, where horses were few, and dogs and canoes and oxen the means of transportation. As the man moved slowly through the streets, his dogs still gallantly full of life after their hard journey, he did not stare about him after the manner of countrymen. His movements had intelligence and freedom. He was an unusual figure for a woodsman or riverman. He did not wear earrings or a waist sash as did the rivermen, and he did not turn in his toes like a woodsman. Yet he was plainly a man from the far mountains. The man with the dogs did not heed the few curious looks turned his way, but held his head down as though walking in familiar places. Now and then he spoke to his dogs, and once he stopped before a newspaper office, which had a placard bearing these lines: "The coming Passion Play in the Chaudiere Valley." He looked at it mechanically, for, though he was concerned in the Passion Play in the Chaudiere Valley, it was an abstraction to him at this moment. His mind was absorbed by other things. Though he looked neither to right nor to left, he was deeply affected by all round him. At last he came to a certain street where he and his dogs travelled more quickly. It opened into a square where bells were booming in the steeple of a church. Shops and offices in the street were shut, but a saloon door was open, and over the doorway was the legend: "Jean Jolicoeur, licensed to sell wine, beer, and other spirituous and fermented liquors." Nearly opposite was a lawyer's office with a new painted sign. It had once read, in plain black letters, "Charles Steele, Barrister, etc." Now it read, in gold letters, and with many flourishes of the sign painter's art: "Rockwell and Tremblay, Barristers, Attorneys, etc." Here the man looked up with trouble in his eyes. He could see dimly the desk and the window beside which he had sat for so many years, and on the wall a map of the city glowed with the incoming sun. He moved on, passing the saloon with the open door. The landlord, in his shirt sleeves, was standing in the doorway. He nodded, then came out to the edge of the boardwalk. "Come a long way, M'sieu'?" he asked. "4 days' journey," answered the man gruffly through his beard, looking the landlord in the eyes. If this landlord, who in the past had seen him so often and so closely, did not recognize him, Surely no one else would. It was, however, a curious recurrence of habit that, as he looked at the landlord, he instinctively felt for his eyeglass, which he had discarded when he left Chaudiere. For an instant there was an involuntary arrest of Jean Jolicoeur's look, as though memory had been roused, but this swiftly passed, and he said: "Fine dogs, them. We never get that kind hereabouts now, M'sieu'. Ever been to the city before?" "I've never been far from home before," answered the Forgotten Man. "You'd better keep your eyes open, my friend, though you've got a sharp pair in your head sharp as Beauty Steele's almost. There's rascals in the riverside drinking places that don't let the left hand know what the right does." "My dogs and I never trust anybody," said the Forgotten Man, as one of the dogs snarled at the landlord's touch. "So I can take care of myself, even if I haven't eyes as sharp as Beauty Steele's, whoever he is." The landlord laughed. "Beauty's only skin deep, they say. Charley Steele was a lawyer. His office was over there." He pointed across the street. "He went wrong. He come here too often. That wasn't my fault. He had an eye like a hawk, and you couldn't read it. Now I can read your eye like a book. There's a bit of spring in him, M'sieu'. His eyes were hard winter ice 5 feet deep and no fishing under. Froze to the bed. He had a tongue like a cross-cut saw. He's at the bottom of the St. Lawrence, leaving a bad job behind him. Have a drink, hein?" He jerked a finger back towards the saloon door. "It's Sunday, but stolen waters are sweet, sure." The Forgotten Man shook his head. "I don't drink, thank you." "It'll do you good. You're dead beat. You've been travelling hard, eh?" "I've come a long way, and travelled all night." "Going on?" "I am going back to morrow." "On business?" Charley nodded. He glanced involuntarily at the sign across the street. Jean Jolicoeur saw the look. "Lawyer's business, p'raps." "A lawyer's business, yes." "Ah, if Charley Steele was here!" "I have as good a lawyer as—" The landlord laughed scornfully. "They're not made. He'd legislate the devil out of the pit. Where are you going to stay, M'sieu'?" "Somewhere cheap along the river," answered the Forgotten Man. Jolicoeur's good natured face became serious. "I'll tell you a place. It's the next street, a few hundred yards down, on the left. There's a wooden fish over the door. It's called the Black Bass, that hotel. Say I sent you. Good luck to you, countryman. Ah, la, la, there's the second bell. I must be getting to Mass." With a nod he turned and went into the house. The Forgotten Man passed slowly up the street into the side street, and followed it till he came to the Black Bass, and turned into the small stable yard. A stableman was stirring. He at once put his dogs into a little pen set apart for them, saw them fed from the kitchen, and betaking himself to a little room behind the bar of the hotel, ordered breakfast. The place was empty, save for the servant. The household were at Mass. He looked round the room abstractedly. He was thinking of a crippled man in a hospital, of a girl from a village in the Chaudiere valley. He thought with a shiver of a white house on the hill. He thought of himself as he had never done before in his life. Passing along the street, he had realized that he had no moral claim upon anything or anybody within these precincts of his past life. The place was a tomb to him. As he sat in the little back parlour of the Black Bass, eating his frugal breakfast of eggs and bread and milk, the meaning of it all slowly dawned upon him. Through his intellect he had known something of humanity, but he had never known men. He had thought of men in the mass, and despised them because of their multitudinous duplication and their typical weaknesses. But he had never known one man or one woman from the subtler, surer divination of the heart. His intellect had made servants and lures of his emotions and his heart, for even his every case in court had been won by easy and selfish command of all those feelings in mankind which make possible personal understanding. In this little back parlour it came to him with sudden force how, long ago, he had cut himself off from any claim upon his fellows, not only by his conduct, but by his merciless, inhuman intelligence working upon the merciful human life about him. He never remembered to have had any real feeling till on that day with Kathleen, the day he died. The bitter complaint of a woman he had wronged cruelly by having married her had wrung from him his own first wail of life, in the one cry, "Kathleen!" As he sat eating his simple meal, his pulses were beating painfully. Every nerve in his body seemed to pluck at the angry flesh. There flashed across his mind in sympathetic sensation a picture. It was the axe factory on the river, before which he used to stand as a boy, and watch the men, naked to the waist, with huge hairy arms and streaming faces, toiling in the red glare, the trip hammers endlessly pounding upon the glowing metal. In old days it had suggested pictures of gods and demigods toiling in the workshops of the primeval world. So the whole machinery of being seemed to be toiling in the light of an awakened conscience to the making of a man. It seemed to him that all his life was being crowded into these hours. His past was here, its posing, its folly, its pitiful uselessness, and its shame. Kathleen and Billy were here, with all the problems that involved them. Rosalie was here, with the great, the last problem. Nothing matters but that. But Rosalie, he said to himself, as he turned to look out of the window at the wrangling dogs gnawing bones. Here she is, in the midst of all I once knew, and I know that I am no more a part of it than she is. She and Kathleen may have met face to face in these streets. Who can tell? The world is large, but there's a sort of whipper in of fate who drives the people wearing the same livery into one corner in the end. If they met. He rose and walked hastily up and down. What then? I have a feeling that Rosalie would recognize her as plainly as though the word Kathleen were stitched on her breast. There was a clock on the wall. He looked at it. It will not be safe to go out until evening. Then I can go to the hospital and watch her coming out. He realized with satisfaction that many people coming from Mass must pass the inn. There was a chance of his seeing Rosalie if she had gone to early Mass. This street lay in her way from the hospital. One look, one look! For this one look he had come. For this, and to secure that which would save Rosalie from want always, if anything should happen to him. This, too, had been greatly on his mind. There was a way to give her what was his very own, which would rob no one and serve her well indeed. Looking at his face in the mirror over the mantel, he said to himself, I might have had 10,000 friends, yet I have 1,000 enemies, who grin at the memory of the drunken fop down among the eels and the catfish. Every chance was with me then. I come back here and old Jolicoeur tells me the brutal truth. But if I had had ambition, a wave of the feeling of the old life passed over him. If I had had ambition as I was then, I should have been a monster. It was all so paltry that, in sheer disgust, I should have kicked every ladder down that helped me up. I should have sacrificed everything to myself. He stopped short and stared, for, in the mirror, he saw a girl passing through the stable yard towards the quarrelling dogs in the kennel. He clapped his hand to his mouth to stop a cry. It was Rosalie. He did not turn round, but looked at her in the mirror, as though it were the last look he might give on earth. He could hear her voice speaking to the dogs. Ah, my friends! Ah, my dears! I know every one of you. Jo Portugais is here. I know your bark, you, Harpy, and you, Lazybones, and you, Cloud in London. I know you, every one. I heard you as I came from Mass, beauty dears. Ah, you know me, sweethearts. Ah, God bless you for coming. You have come to bring us home. You have come to fetch us home, father and me. The paws of one of the dogs was on her shoulder, and his nose was in her hair. Charley heard her words, for the window was open, and he listened and watched now with an infinite relief in his look. Her face was half turned towards him. It was pale, very pale, and sad. It was Rosalie as of old, thank God, as of old, but more beautiful in the touching sadness, the far-off longing of her look. I must go and see your master, she said to the dogs. Down, down, Lazybones! There was no time to lose. He must not meet her here. He went into the outer hall hastily. The servant was passing through. If any one asks for Jo Portugais, he said, say that I'll be back to morrow morning. I'm going across the river to day. Certainly, M'sieu', said the girl, and smiled because of the piece of silver he put in her hand. As he heard the side door open, he stepped through the front doorway into the street, and disappeared around the corner. Chapter 46. Recording by Tom Weiss, Tom'sAudiobooks.com. Chapters 47 through 49 of The Right Away by Gilbert Parker. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss. Chapter 47. One was taken, and the other left. Rosalie carried to the hospital that afternoon a lighter heart than she had known for many a day. The sight of Jo Portugais' dogs had roused her out of the apathy which had been growing on her in this patient but hopeless watching beside her father. She had always a smile and a cheerful word for the poor man. A settled sorrow hung upon her face, however, taking away its color, but giving it a sweet gravity which made her slave more than one young doctor of the hospital, for whom, however, she showed no more than a friendly frankness, free from self-consciousness. For hours she would sit in reverie beside her sleeping father, her heart over the water to Charley. As in a trance, she could see him sitting at his bench, bent over his work, now and again lifting up his head to look across to the post office, where another hand than hers sorted letters now. Day by day her father weakened and faded away. All that was possible to medical skill had been done. As the money left by her mother dwindled, she had no anxiety, for she knew that the life she so tenderly cherished would not outlast the gold which lengthened out the tenuous chain of being. This last illness of her father's had been the salvation of her mind, the saving of her health. Maybe it had been the saving of her soul, for at times a curious contempt of life came upon her, she who had loved it so eagerly and fully. There descended on her then the bitter conviction that never again would she see the man she loved. Then not even Mrs. Flynn could call back the fun of the world to her step, and her tongue, and her eye. At first there had been a timid shrinking, but soon her father and herself were brighter and better for the old Irishwoman's presence, and she began to take comfort in Mrs. Flynn. Mrs. Flynn gave hopefulness to whatever life she touched, and Rosalie, buoyant and hopeful enough by nature, responded to the living warmth and the religion of life in the Irishwoman's heart. "'Tis worth the doin', ivery bit of it, darlin', the bither and the swate, the hard and the easy, the rough and the smooth, the good and the bad," said Mrs. Flynn to her this very Easter morning. "Even the avil is worth doin', if so be 'twas not meant, and the good is in your heart in the ind, and ye be doin' turnup to the Almighty, repentin' and glad to be alive, provin' to Him 'twas worth while makin' the world and you to want, and worry, and work, and play, and pick the flowers, and bleed of the thorns, and drink the sun, and ate the dust, and be lovin' all the way." "Ah, that's it, darlin'," persisted Mrs. Flynn. "'Tis lovin' all the way makes it aisier. There's many kinds o' love. There's lad and lass, there's maid and man, and that last is spring, and all the birds singin', and shtorms now and then, and siparations and mistrust, and God in heaven bein' that aisy with ye for bein' fools and children, and bringin' ye together in the ind, if so be ye do be lovin' as man and maid should love, wid all your heart. Then there's the love of man and wife. Shure, that's the love that lasts, if it starts right. Shure, it doesn't always start with the sun shinin'. 'Will you marry me?' says Teddy Flynn to me. 'I will,' says I. 'Then I'll come back from Canady to fetch you,' says he, with a tear in his eye. For what's a man in old Ireland that has a head for anything but puddities? There's land free in Canady, and I'm goin' to make a home for ye, Mary,' says he, wavin' a piece of paper in the air. 'Are ye then?' says I. He goes away that night, and the next morning I have a letter from him, sayin' he's startin' that day for Canady. He hadn't the heart to tell me face to face. What do I do then? I begs, borrows, and stales, and I reached that ship 1 minute before she sailed. There was no praist aboard, but we was married 6 weeks after at Quebec. and together we lived with ups and downs, but no ups and downs to the love of us for 20 years, blessed be God for all his mercies." Rosalie had listened with eyes that hungrily watched every expression, ears that weighed eagerly every inflection, for she was hearing the story of another's love, and it did not seem strange to her that a woman, old, red-faced and fat, should be telling it. Yet there are times when she wept till she was exhausted, when all her girlhood was drowned in the overflow of her eyes, when there was a sense of irrevocable loss upon her. Then it was, in her fear of soul and pitiful loneliness, that her lover, the man she would have died for, seemed to have deserted her. Then it was that a sudden hatred against him rose up in her, to be swept away as swiftly as it came, by the memory of his broken tale of love, his passionate words: "I have never loved any one but you in all my life, Rosalie." And also there was that letter from Chaudiere, which said that in the hour when the greatest proof of his love must be given, he would give it. Reading the letter again, hatred, doubt, even sorrow passed from her, and her imagination pictured the hour when, disguise and secrecy ended, he would step forward before all the world and say: "I take thee, Rosalie Evanturel, to be my wife." Despite the gusts of emotion that swayed her at times, in the deepest part of her being she trusted him completely. When she reached the hospital this Sunday afternoon, her step was quick, her smile bright, though she had not been to confession as was her duty on Easter Day. The impulse towards it had been great, but her secret was not her own, and the passionate desire to give relief to her full heart was overborne by thought of the man. Her soul was her own, but this secret of their love was his as well as hers. She knew that she was the only judge between. Soon after she entered the ward, the chief surgeon said that all that could be done for her father had now been done, and that as M. Evanturel constantly asked to be taken back to Chaudiere, he never said to die, though they knew what was in his mind, he might now make the journey, partly by river, partly by land. It seemed to the delighted and excited Rosalie that Jo Portugais had been sent to her as a surprise, and that his team of dogs was to take her father back. She sat by her father's bed this beautiful, wonderful Sunday morning, and talked cheerfully, and laughed a little, and told M. Evanturel of the dogs, and together they looked out of the window to the far off hills, in their golden purple, beyond which, in the valley of the Chaudiere, was their little home. With her father's hand in hers, the girl dreamed dreams again, and it seemed to her that she was the very Rosalie Evanturel of old, whose thoughts were bounded by a river and a hill, a post office and a church, a catechism and a few score of books. Here in the crowded city she had come to be a woman who, bitterly shaken in soul, knew life's sufferings, who had, during the past few months, read with avidity history, poetry, romance, fiction, and the drama, English and French, for in every one she found something that said, "You have felt that." In these long months she had learned more than she had known or learned in all her previous life. As she sat looking out into the eastern sky, she became conscious of voices, and of a group of people who came slowly down the ward, sometimes speaking to the sick and crippled. It was not a general visitors' day, but one reserved for the few to come and say a kindly word to the suffering, to bring some flowers and distribute books. Rosalie had always been absent at this hour before, for she shrank from strangers, but to day she stayed on, unthinking. It mattered nothing to her who came and went. Her heart was over the hills, and the only tie she had here was with this poor cripple whose hand she held. If she did not resent the visit of these kindly strangers, she resolutely held herself apart from the object of their visit with a sense of distance and cold dignity. If she had given Charley something of herself, she had in turn taken something from him, something unlike her old self, delicately non intimate. Knowledge of life had rationalized her emotions to a definite degree, had given her the pride of self-repression. She had need of it in these surroundings, where her beauty drew not a little dangerous attention, which she had held at arm's length. Her great love for one man made her invulnerable. Now, as the visitors came near,
She did not turn towards them, but still sat, her chin on her hand, looking out across the hills in resolute abstraction. She felt her father's fingers press hers, as if to draw her attention, for he, weak man, was ever ready to open his hand and heart to any friendly soul. She took no notice, but held his hand firmly, as though to say that she had no wish to see. She was conscious now that they were beside her father's bed. She hoped that they would pass. But no, the feet stopped. There was whispering, and then she heard a voice say, "Rather rude!" Then another, "Not wanted, that's plain." The first a woman's, the second a man's. Then another voice, clear, cold, and well modulated, said to her father, "They tell me you have been here a long time, and have had much pain. You will be glad to go, I am sure." Something in the voice startled her. Some familiar sound or inflection struck upon her ear with a far-off note, some lost tone she knew. Of what, of whom, did this voice remind her? She turned round quickly and caught two cold blue eyes looking at her. The face was older than her own, handsome and still, and happy in a placid sort of way. Few gusts of passion or of pain had passed across that face. The figure was shapely to the newest fashion, the bonnet was perfect, the hand which held two books was prettily gloved. Polite charity was written in her manner, and consecrated every motion. On the instant, Rosalie resented this fine epitome of convention, this dutiful charity monger, herself the centre of an admiring quartet. She saw the whispering, she noted the well-bred disguise of interest, and she met the visitor's gaze with cold courtesy. The other read the look in her face, and a slightly pacifying smile gathered at her lips. "We are glad to hear that your father is better. He has been ill a long time?" Rosalie started again, for the voice perplexed her, rather not the voice, but the inflection, the deliberation. She bowed and set her lips, but chancing to glance at her father, she saw that he was troubled by her manner. Flashing a look of love at him, she adjusted the pillow under his head, and said to her questioner in a low voice, "He is better now, thank you." Encouraged, the other rejoined, "May I leave one or two books for him to read, or for you to read to him?" Then added hastily, for she saw a curious look in Rosalie's eyes, "We can have mutual friends in books, though we cannot be friends with each other. Books are the go-betweens of humanity." Rosalie's heart leapt. She flushed, then grew slightly pale, for it was not tone or inflection alone that disturbed her now, but words themselves. A voice from over the hills seemed to say these things to her. A haunting voice from over the hills had said them to her, these very words. "Friends need no go-betweens," she said quietly, "and enemies should not use them." She heard a voice say, "By Jove!" in a tone of surprise, as though it were wonderful the girl from Chaudiere should have her wits about her. So Rosalie interpreted it. "Have you many friends here?" asked the cold voice, meant to be kindly and pacific. It was schooled to composure, because it gave advantage in life's intercourse, not from any inner urbanity. "Some need many friends, some but a few. I come from a country where one only needs few." "Where is your country, I wonder?" said the cold echo of another voice. Charley had passed out of Kathleen's life. He was dead to her, his memory scorned and buried. She loved the man to whom she supposed she was married. She was only too glad to let the dust of death and time cover every trace of Charley from her gaze. She would have rooted out every particle of association. Yet his influence on her had been so great that she had unconsciously absorbed some of his idiosyncrasies, in the tone of his voice, in his manner of speaking. To day she had even repeated phrases he had used. "Beyond the hills," said Rosalie, turning away. "Is it not strange?" said the voice. "That is the title of one of the books I have just brought. Beyond the Hills. It is by an English writer. This other book is French. May I leave them?" Rosalie inclined her head. It would make her own position less dignified if she refused them. "Books are always welcome to my father," she said. There was an instant's pause, as though the fashionable lady would offer her hand, but their eyes met, and they only bowed.
The lady moved on with a smile, leaving a perfume of heliotrope behind her. "Where is your country, I wonder?" The voice of the lady rang in Rosalie's ears. As she sat at the window again, long after the visitors had disappeared, the words "I wonder, I wonder, I wonder," kept beating in her brain. It was absurd that this woman should remind her of the tailor of Chaudiere. Suddenly she was roused by her father's voice. "This is beautiful, ah, but beautiful, Rosalie!" She turned towards him. He was reading the book in his hand, Beyond the Hills. "Listen," he said, and he read in English. "Compensation is the other name for God. How often is it that those whom disease or accident have robbed of active life find greater inner rejoicing and a larger spiritual itinerary? It would seem that withdrawal from the ruder activities gives a clearer seeing. Also for these, so often, is granted a greater love, which comes of the consecration of other lives to theirs. And these, too, have their reward, for they are less encompassed by the vanities of the world, having the joy of self-sacrifice." He looked at Rosalie with an unnatural brightness in his eyes, and she smiled at him now, and stroked his hand. "It has all been compensation to me," he said after a moment. "You have been a good daughter to me, Rosalie." She shook her head and smiled. "Good fathers think they have good daughters," she answered, choking back a sob. He closed the book and let it lie upon the coverlet. "I will sleep now," he said, and turned on his side. She arranged his pillow and adjusted the bedclothes to his comfort. "Good night," he said, as with a faint hand he drew her head down and kissed her. "Good girl. Good night." She patted his hand. "It is not night yet, father." He was already half asleep. "Good night," he said again, and fell into a deep sleep. She sat down by the window, in her hand the book he had laid down. 100 thoughts were busy in her brain, of her father, of the woman who had just left, of her lover over the hills. The woman's voice came to her again, a far off mockery. She opened the book mechanically and turned over the pages. Presently her eyes were riveted to a page. On it was written the word Kathleen. For a moment she sat transfixed. The word Kathleen and the haunting voice became one, and her mind ran back to the day when she had said to Charley, "Who is Kathleen?" She sprang to her feet. What should she do? Follow the woman? Find out who and what she was? Go to the young surgeon who had accompanied them, ask him who she was, and so learn the clue to the mystery concerning her lover? In the midst of her confusion she became sharply conscious of two things: the approach of Mrs. Flynn, and her father's heavy breathing. Dropping the book, she leaned over her father's bed and looked closely at him. Then she turned to the frightened and anxious Mrs. Flynn. "Go for the priest," she said. "He is dying." "I'll send some one. I'm stayin' here by you, darlin'," said the old woman, and hurried to the room of the young surgeon for a messenger. As the sun went down, the cripple went out upon a long journey alone. Chapter 48. Where the Tree of Life is Blooming. As Charley walked the bank of the great river by the city where his old life lay dead, he struggled with the new life which, long or short, must henceforth belong to the village of the woman he loved. But as he fought with himself in the long night watch, it was borne in upon him that though he had been shown the promised land, he might never find there a habitation and a home. The hymn he had mockingly sung the night he had been done to death at the Cote Dorion sang in his senses now, an ever-present mockery. On the other side of Jordan, in the sweet fields of Eden, where the tree of life is blooming, there is rest for you. There is rest for the weary. There is rest for the weary. There is rest for the weary. There is rest for you. In the uttermost corner of his intelligence he felt with sure prescience that, however befalling, the end of all was not far off. In the exercise of the new faculties, which had more to do with the soul than with reason, he now believed what he could not see, and recognized what was not proved. Labor of the hand, trouble, sorrow, and perplexity, charity and humanity, had cleared and simplified his life, had sweetened his intelligence, and taken the place of ambition. He saw life now through the lens of personal duty, which required that the thing nearest to one's hand should be done first. But as foreboding pressed upon him, there came the thought of what should come after, to Rosalie. His thoughts took a practical form. Her good was uppermost in his mind. All Rosalie had to live on was her salary as postmistress, for it was in every one's knowledge that the little else she had was being sacrificed to her father's illness. Suppose, then, that through illness or accident she lost her position, what could she do? He might leave her what he had, but what had he? Enough to keep her for a year or two, no more. All his earnings had gone to the poor and the suffering of Chaudiere. There was one way. It had suggested itself to him so often in Chaudiere, and had been one of the two reasons for bringing him here. There were his dead mother's pearls, and $1,000 in notes behind a secret panel in the White House on the hill, in this very city where he was. The pearls were worth over $10,000. In all, there would be $11,000, enough to secure Rosalie from poverty. What should Kathleen do with his mother's pearls, even if they were found by her? What should she do with his money? Did she not loathe his memory? Had not all his debts been paid? These pearls and this money were all his own. But to get them, to go now to the White House on the hill, to face that old life even for an hour, a knocking at the door of a haunted house. He shrank from the thought. He would have to enter the place like a thief in the night. Yet for Rosalie he must take the risk. He must go. Chapter 48. Chapter 49. The Open Gate. It was a still night, and the moon, delicately bright, gave forth that radiance which makes spiritual to the eye the coarsest thing. Inside the White House on the hill all was dark. Sleep had settled on it long before midnight, for, on the morrow, its master and mistress hoped to make a journey to the village of Chaudiere, where the Passion Play was being performed by habitants and Indians. The desire to see the play had become an infatuation in the minds of the two, eager for some interest to relieve the monotony of a happy life. But as all slept, a figure in the dress of a habitant moved through the passages of the house stealthily, yet with an assurance unusual in the thief or housebreaker. In the darkest passages his step was sure, and his hand fastened on latch or door knob with perfect precision. He came at last into a large hallway flooded by the moon, pale, watchful, his beard frosted by the light. In the stillness of his tread, and the composed sorrow of his face, he seemed like one long dead who revisits the glimpses of the moon. At last he entered a room the door of which stood wide open. In this room had been begotten, or had had exercise, whatever of him was worth approving in the days before he died. It was a place of books and statues and tapestry, and the dark oak was nobly smutched of time. This sombre oaken wall had been handed down through 4 generations from the man's great-grandfather. The breath of generations had steeped it in human association. Entering, he turned for an instant with clenched hands to look at another door across the hall. Behind that door were 2 people, who despised his memory, who conspired to forget his very name. This house was the woman's, for he had given it to her the day he died. But that she could live there with all the old associations, with memories that, however bitter, however shaming, had a sort of sacredness, struck into his soul with a harrowing pain. There she was with whom he had spared, himself, whose happiness had lain in his hands, and he had given it to her. Yet her very existence robbed himself of happiness, and made sorrowful a life dearer than his own. Kathleen lay asleep in that room. He fancied he could hear her breathing. And, by the hospital on the hill, up beyond the point of pines, in a little cottage where he could see from the great window, lay Rosalie with sleepless eyes and wan cheeks, longing for morning and the stir of life to help her forget. For Rosalie he had come to this house once more. For her sake he was revisiting this torture chamber, from which he knew he must go again, blanched and shaken, as a man goes from a tomb where his dead lie unforgiving. He shut his teeth, went swiftly across the room, and beside a great carved oak table touched the hidden spring in the side of it. The spring snapped. The panel creaked a little and drew back. It seemed to him that the noise he made must be heard in every part of the house, so sensitive was his ear, so deep was the silence on which the sounds had broken. He turned round to the doorway to listen, before he put his hand within the secret place. There was no sound. He turned his attention to the table. Drawing forth 2 packets with a gasp of relief, he put them in his pocket and, with extreme care, proceeded to close the panel. By rubbing the edges of the wood with grease from a candle on the table, he was able to readjust the panel in silence. But as the spring came home, he became suddenly conscious of a presence in the room. A shiver passed through him. He turned round softly, quickly. He was in the shadow and near great window curtains, and his fingers instinctively clutched them as he saw a figure in white at the door of the room. Slowly, strangely deliberate, the figure moved further into the room. Charley's breath stopped. He felt his face flush, and a strange weakness came on him. There before him stood Kathleen. She was in her nightgown, and she stood still, as though listening, yet as Charley looked closer, he realized that it was an unconscious passive listening, and that she did not know he was there. Her mind only was listening. She was asleep. Was it possible that his very presence in the house had touched some old note of memory which, automatically responding, had carried her from her bed in this somnambulistic trance? That subtle telegraphy between our subconscious selves which we cannot reduce to a law, yet alarming us at times, announced to Kathleen's mind, independent of the waking senses, the presence once familiar to this house for so many years. In her sleep she had involuntarily responded to the call of Charley's approach. Once in the past, the night her uncle died, she had walked in her sleep, and the memory of this flashed upon Charley now. Silently he came closer to her. The moonlight shone on her face. He could see plainly she was asleep. His position was painful and perilous. If she waked, the shock to herself would be great. If she waked and saw him, what disaster might not occur? Yet he had no agitation now, only clearness of mind and a curious sense of confusion that he should see her en deshabille, that old fastidious sense mingling with the feeling that she was now a stranger to him, and that, waking, she would fly embarrassed from his presence, as he was ready to fly from hers. He was about to steal to the door and escape before she waked, but she turned round, moved through the doorway, and glided down the hall. He followed silently. She moved to the staircase, then slowly down it, and through a passage to a morning room, where, opening a pair of French windows, she passed out on to the lawn. He followed, not more than a dozen paces behind her. His safety lay in getting outside, where he could easily hide among the bushes, should someone else appear, and an alarm be raised. She crossed the lawn swiftly, a white, ghost-like figure. In the middle of the lawn she stopped short once, as if in doubt what to do, as a thought-reader pauses in his search for the mental scent again, ere he rushes upon the subject of his search with the certainty of instinct. Presently she moved on, going directly towards a gate that opened out on the cliff above the river. In Charley's day this gate had been often used, for it gave upon 4 steep wooden steps leading to a narrow shelf of rock below. From the edge of this cliff a rope ladder dropped 50 feet to the river. For years he had used this rope ladder to get down to his boat, and often, when they were first married, Kathleen used to come and watch him descend, and sometimes, just at the very first, would descend also. As he stole into the grounds this evening he had noticed, however, that the rope ladder was gone, and that new steps were being built. He had also mechanically observed that the gate was open. For an instant he watched her slowly moving towards the gate. At first he did not realize the situation. Suddenly her danger flashed upon him. Passing through the gateway, she must fall over the cliff. Her life was in his hands. He could rush forward swiftly and close the gate, then, raising an alarm, get away before he was seen, or he could escape now. What had he to do with her? A weird, painful suggestion crept into his brain. He was not responsible for her, and he was responsible for a woman up there by the hospital, whose home was the valley of the Chaudiere. If Kathleen were gone, what barrier would there be between him and Rosalie? What had he to do with this strange disposition of events? Kathleen was never absent from her church twice on Sundays. She was devoted to work of all sorts for the church on weekdays. Where was her intervening personal providence? If Providence permitted her to die, well, she had had 2 years of happiness with the man she loved, at some expense to himself. Was it not fair that Rosalie should have her share? Had he the right to call upon Rosalie for constant self-sacrifice, when, by shutting his eyes now, by being dead to Kathleen and her need, as he was dead to the world he once knew, the way would be clear to marry Rosalie? Dead. He was dead to the world, and to Kathleen. Should his ghost interpose between her and the death now within 20 feet of her? Who could know? It was grim, it was awful, but was it not a wild kind of justice? Who could blame? It was the old Charley Steele, the Charley Steele of the courtroom, who argued back humanity and the inherent rightness of things. But it was only a moment's pause. The thoughts flashed by like the lightning impressions of a dream, and a voice said in his ear, the voice of the new Charley with a conscience, "Save her! Save her!" Even as he was conscious of another presence on the lawn, he rushed forward noiselessly. Stealing between Kathleen and the gate, she was within 5 feet of it, he closed and locked it. Then, with a quick glance at her sleeping face, it was engraven on his memory ever after like a dead face in a coffin, he ran along the fence among the shrubbery. A man not 50 feet away called to him. "Hush! She is asleep," Charley whispered, and disappeared. It was Fairing himself who saw this deed which saved Kathleen's life. Awaking and not finding her, he had glanced towards the window and had seen her on the lawn. He had rushed down to her, in time to see her saved by a strange bearded man in habit and dress. His one glance at the man's face, as it turned towards him, produced an extraordinary effect upon his mind, not soon to be dispelled. A haunting, ghost-like apparition, which kept reminding him of something or somebody, he could not tell what or whom. The whispering voice and the breathless words, "Hush! She is asleep!" repeated themselves over and over again in his brain, as, taking Kathleen's hand, he led her, unresisting and still sleeping, back to her room. In agitated thankfulness he resolved not to speak of the event to Kathleen, or to any one else, lest it should come to her ears and frighten her. He would, however, keep a sharp lookout for the man who had saved her life, and would reward him duly. The face of the bearded habitant came between him and his sleep. Meanwhile, this disturber of a woman's dreams and a man's sleep was hurrying to an inn in the town by the waterside, where he met another habitant with a team of dogs, Jo Portugais. Jo had not been able to bear the misery of suspense and anxiety, and had come seeking him. There was little speech between them. "You have not been found out, M'sieu'?" was Jo's anxious question. "No, no, but I have had a bad night, Jo. Get the dogs together." A little later, as Charley made ready to go back to Chaudiere, Jo said, "You look as if you had a bad dream, M'sieu'." With the river rustling by, and the trees stirring in the first breath of dawn, Charley told Jo what had happened. For a moment the murderer did not speak or stir, for a struggle was going on in his breast also. Then he stooped quickly, caught his companion's hand, and kissed it. "I could not have done it, M'sieu'," he said hoarsely. They parted, Jo to remain behind as they had agreed, to be near Rosalie if needed, Charley to return to the valley of the Chaudiere. Chapter 49. Recording by Tom Weiss. Tom'sAudiobooks.com.
Chapters 50 through 53 of The Right of Way by Gilbert Parker. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss. Chapter 50. The Passion Play at Chaudiere. For the first time in its history, Chaudiere was becoming notable in the eyes of the outside world. "We'll have more girth after this," said Filion Lacasse the saddler to the wife of the Notary, as in front of the post office they stood watching a little cavalcade of habitants going up the road towards Four Mountains to rehearse the Passion Play. "If Dauphin's advice had been taken long ago, we'd have had a hotel at Four Mountains, and the city folk would be coming here for the summer," said Madame Dauphin with a superior air. "Fish," said a voice behind them. It was the Seigneur's groom, with a straw in his mouth. He had a gloomy mind. "There isn't a house but has 2 or 3 boarders. I've got 3," said Filion Lacasse. "They come to-morrow." "We'll have 10 at the Manor, but no good will come of it," said the groom. "No good? Look at the infidel tailor," said Madame Dauphin. "He translated all the writing, he drew all the dresses, and made 100 pictures. There they are, at the Cure's house." "He should have played Judas," said the groom malevolently. "That'd be right for him." "Perhaps you don't like the Passion Play?" said Madame Dauphin disdainfully. "We ain't through with it yet," said the death's head groom. "It is a pious and holy mission," said Madame Dauphin. "Even that Jo Portugais worked night and day till he went away to Montreal, and he always goes to Mass now. He's to take Pontius Pilate when he comes back. Then look at Virginie Morset, that put her brother's eyes out quarrelling. She's to play Mary Magdalene." "I could fit the parts better," said the groom. "Of course, you'd have played St. John," said the saddler, "or maybe Christus himself. I'd have Paulette Dubois play Mary the Sinner." "Magdalene repented and knelt at the foot of the cross. She was sorry and sinned no more," said the Notary's wife in querulous reprimand. "Well, Paulette does all that," said the stolid, dark-visaged groom. Filion Lacasse's ears pricked up. "How do you know? She hasn't come back?" "Hasn't she, though? And with her child, too, last night." "Her child?" Madame Dauphin was scandalized and amazed. The groom nodded. "And doesn't care who knows it. 7 years old, and as fine a child as ever was." "Narcisse! Narcisse!" called Madame Dauphin to her husband, who was coming up the street. She hastily repeated the groom's news to him. The Notary stuck his hand between the buttons of his waistcoat. "Well, well, my dear madame," he said consequentially. "It is quite true." "What do you know about it? Whose child is it?" she asked with curdling scorn. "Sh!" said the Notary. Then, with an oratorical wave of his free hand, "The Church opens her arms to all, even to her who sinned much because she loved much, who, through woeful years, searched the world for her child and found it not, hidden away as it was by the duplicity of sinful man," and so on through tangled sentences, setting forth in broken terms Paulette Dubois's life. "How do you know all about it?" asked the saddler. "I've known it for years," said the Notary grandly, stoutly too, for he would freely risk his wife's anger that the vain glory of the moment might be enlarged. "And you keep it even from Madame?" said the saddler, with a smile too broad to be sarcastic. "Tiens, if I did that, my wife'd pick my eyes out with a bradawl." "It was a professional secret," said the Notary, with a desperate resolve to hold his position. "I'm going home, Dauphin. Are you coming?" questioned his wife with an air. "You will remain and hear what I've got to say. This Paulette Dubois, she should play Mary Magdalene for—" "Look, look, what's that?" said the saddler. He pointed to a wagon coming slowly up the road. In front of it a team of dogs drew a cart. It carried something covered with black. "It's a funeral. There's the coffin. It's on Jo Portugais' little cart," added Filion Lacasse. "Ah, God be merciful! It's Rosalie Evanturel and Mrs. Flynn, and Monsieur Evanturel in the coffin," said Madame Dauphin, running to the door of the post office to call the Cure's sister. "There'll be use enough for the baker's dead march now," remarked M. Dauphin sadly, buttoning up his coat, taking off his hat, and going forward to greet Rosalie. As he did so, Charley appeared in the doorway of his shop. "Look, Monsieur," said the Notary. "This is the way Rosalie Evanturel comes home with her father." "I will go for the Cure," Charley answered, turning white. He leaned against the doorway for a moment to steady himself, then hurried up the street. He did not dare meet Rosalie, or go near her yet. For her sake it was better not. "That tailor infidel has a heart. His eyes were leaking," said the Notary to Filion Lacasse, and went on to meet the mournful cavalcade. Chapter 51. Face to Face.
If I could only understand! This was Rosalie's constant cry in these weeks wherein she lay ill and prostrate after her father's burial. Once, and once only, had she met Charley alone, though she knew that he was keeping watch over her. She had first seen him the day her father was buried, standing apart from the people, his face sorrowful, his eyes heavy, his figure bowed. The occasion of their meeting alone was the first night of her return, when the Notary and Charley had kept watch beside her father's body. She had gone into the little hallway, and had looked into the room of death. The Notary was sound asleep in his armchair, but Charley sat silent and moveless, his eyes gazing straight before him. She murmured his name, and though it was only to herself, not even a whisper, he got up quickly and came to the hall, where she stood grief-stricken, yet with a smile of welcome, of forgiveness, of confidence. As she put out her hand to him, and his swallowed it, she could not but say to him, so contrary is the heart of a woman, so does she demand a yes by asserting a no, and hunger for the eternal assurance, she could not but say, "You do not love me now?" It was but a whisper, so faint and breathless that only the heart of love could hear it. There was no answer in words, for someone was stirring beyond Rosalie in the dark, and a great figure heaved through the kitchen doorway, but his hand crushed hers in his own. His heart said to her, "My love is an undying light. It will not change for time or tears." The words they had read together in a little snuff-coloured book on the counter in the shop one summer day, a year ago. The words flashed into his mind, and they were carried to hers. Her fingers pressed his, and then Charley said over her shoulder to the approaching Mrs. Flynn, "Do not let her come again, Madame. She should get some sleep." And he put her hand in Mrs. Flynn's. "Be good to her, as you know how, Mrs. Flynn," he added gently. He had won the heart of Mrs. Flynn that moment, and it may be she had a conviction or an inspiration, for she said in a softer voice than she was wont to use to any one save Rosalie, "I do by her as you do by your own, sir," and tenderly drew Rosalie to her own room. Such had been their first meeting after her return. Afterwards she was taken ill, and the torture of his heart drove him out into the night, to walk the road and creep round her house like a sentinel, Mrs. Flynn's words ringing in his ears to reproach him. "I'll do by her as you would do by your own, sir." Night after night it was the same, and Rosalie heard his footsteps and listened and was less sorrowful, because she knew that she was ever in his thoughts. But one day Mrs. Flynn came to him in his shop. "She's wantin' a word with ye on business," she said, and gestured towards the little house across the way. "'Tis few words ye do be shpakin' to anybody, but if ye have kind words to shpake and good things to say, ye naedn't be bitin' your tongue," she added in response to his nod, and left him. Charley looked after her with a troubled face. On the instant it seemed to him that Mrs. Flynn knew all. But his second thought told him that it was only an instinct on her part that there was something between them, the beginning of love maybe. In another half hour he was beside Rosalie's chair. "Perhaps you are angry," she said as he came towards her where she sat in the great armchair. She did not give him time to answer, but hurried on. "I wanted to tell you that I have heard you every night outside, and that I have been glad and sorry too, so sorry for us both." "Rosalie, Rosalie!" he said hoarsely, and dropped on a knee beside her chair, and took her hand and kissed it. He did not dare do more. "I wanted to say to you," she said, dropping a hand on his shoulder, "that I do not blame you for anything, not for anything. Yet I want you to be sorry too. I want you to feel as sorry for me as I feel sorry for you."
I am the worst man, and you the best woman in the world." She leaned over him with tears in her eyes. "Hush!" she said. "I want to help you, Charles. You are wise. You know 10,000 things more than I, but I know one thing you do not understand." "You know and do whatever is good," he said brokenly. "Oh, no, no, no! But I know one thing, because I have been taught, and because it was born with me. Perhaps much was habit with me in the past, but now I know that one thing is true. It is God." She paused. "I have learned so much since then." He looked up with a groan, and put a finger on her lips. "You are feeling bitterly sorry for me," she said. "But you must let me speak. That is all I ask. It is all love asks. I cannot bear that you should not share my thoughts. That is the thing that has hurt so all these months, these long, hard months, when I could not see you, and did not know why I could not. Don't shake so, please. Hear me to the end, and we shall both be the better after. I felt it all so cruelly because I did not, and I do not, understand. I rebelled, but not against you. I rebelled against myself, against what you called fate. Fate is oneself, what one brings on oneself. But I had faith in you, always, always, even when I thought I hated you." "Ah, hate me, hate me! It is your loving that cuts me to the quick," he said. "You have the magnanimity of God." Her eyes leapt up. "Of God? You believe in God?" she said eagerly. "God is God to you? He is the one thing that has come out of all this to me." She reached out her hand and took her Bible from a table. "Read that to yourself," she said, and opening the book, pointed to a passage. He read it. "And they heard the voice of the Lord God walking in the garden in the cool of the day. And Adam and his wife hid themselves from the presence of the Lord God amongst the trees of the garden. And the Lord God called unto Adam, and said unto him, Where art thou? And he said, I heard thy voice in the garden, and I was afraid, because I was naked, and I hid myself. And he said, Who told thee that thou wart naked? Hast thou eaten of the tree whereof I commanded thee that thou shouldest not eat?" Closing the book, Charley said, "I understand, I see." "Will you say a prayer with me?" she urged. "It is all I ask. It is the only thing I want to hurt you, because it may make you happier in the end. What keeps us apart, I do not know. But if you will say one prayer with me, I will keep on trusting, I will never complain, and I will wait." He kissed both her hands, but the look in his eyes was that of a man being broken on the wheel. She slipped to the floor, her rosary in her fingers. "Let us pray," she said simply, and in a voice as clear as a child's, but with the anguish of a woman's struggling heart behind. He did not move. She looked at him, caught his hands in both of hers, and cried, "But you will not deny me this? Haven't I the right to ask it? Haven't I a right to ask of you 1,000 times as much?" "You have the right to ask all that is mine to give life, honor, my body in pieces inch by inch, the last that I can call my own. But, Rosalie, this is not mine to give. How can I pray unless I believe?" "You do, oh, you do believe in God!" she cried passionately. "Rosalie, my life," he urged, hoarse misery in his voice, "the only thing I have to give you is the bare soul of a truthful man. I am that now, at least. You have made me so. If I deceived the whole world, if I was as the thief upon the cross, I should still be truthful to you. You open your heart to me, let me open mine to you, to see it as it is. Once my soul was like a watch, cased and carried in the pocket of life, uncertain, untrue, because it was a soul made, not born. I must look at the hands to know the time, and because it varied, because the working did not answer to the absolute, I said, the soul is alive. You have changed all that, Rosalie. My soul now is like a dial of the sun, but the clouds are there above, and I do not know what time it is in life. When the clouds break, if they ever break, and the sun shines, the dial will speak the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
He paused, confused, for he had repeated the words of a witness taking the oath in court. "So help me God!" She finished the oath for him. Then, with a sudden change of manner, she came to her feet with a spring. She did not quite understand. She was, however, dimly conscious of the power she had over his chivalrous mind, the power of the weak over the strong, the tyranny of the defended over the defender. She was a woman tortured beyond bearing, and she was fighting for her very life, mad with anguish as she struggled. "I don't understand you," she cried with flashing eyes. "One minute you say you do not believe in anything, and the next you say, 'So help me God!'" "Ah, no, you said that, Rosalie," he interposed gently. "You said I was as magnanimous as God. You were laughing at me then, mocking me, whose only fault is that I loved and trusted you. In the wickedness of your heart you robbed me of happiness, you—" "Don't, Rosalie, Rosalie!" he exclaimed in a shrinking protest. That she had spoken to him as her deepest heart abhorred only increased her agitated denunciation. "Yes, yes, in your mad selfishness you did not care for the poor girl who forgot all, lost all, and now—" She stopped short at the sight of his white, awe-stricken face. His eyeglass seemed like a frost of death over an eye that looked upon some shocking scene of woe. Yet he appeared not to see, for his fingers fumbled on his waistcoat for the monocle, fumbled vaguely, helplessly. It was the realization of a soul cast into the outer darkness. Her abrupt silence came upon him like the last engulfing wave to a drowning man, the final assurance of the end, in which there is quiet and the deadly smother. "Now I know the truth," he said in a curious even tone, different from any she had ever heard from him. It was the old Charley Steele who spoke, the Charley Steele in whom the intellect was supreme once more. The judicial spirit, the inveterate intelligence which put justice before all, was alive in him, almost rejoicing in its regained governance. The new Charley was as dead as the old had been of late, and this clarifying moment left the grim impression behind that the old law was not obsolete. He felt that in the abandonment of her indignation she had mercilessly told the truth, and the irreducible quality of mind in him which in the old days made for justice, approved. There was a new element now, however, that conscience which never possessed him fully until the day he saw Rosalie go travelling over the hills with her crippled father. That picture of the girl against the twilight, her figure silhouetted in the clear air, had come to him in sleeping and waking dreams, the type and sign of an everlasting melancholy. As he looked at her blindly now, he saw not herself, but that melancholy figure. Out of the distance his own voice said again: "Now I know the truth." She had struck with a violence she did not intend, which she knew must rend her own heart in the future, which put in the dice box the last hope she had. But she could not have helped it. She could not have stayed the words, though a suspended sword were to fall with the same. It was the cry of tradition and religion, and every home-bred, convent-nurtured habit, the instinct of heredity, the wail of woman for whom destiny, or man, or nature, has arranged the disproportionate share of life's penalties. It was the impotent rebellion against the first curse, that man in his punishment should earn his bread by the sweat of his brow, which he might do with joy, while the woman must work out her ordained sentence in sorrow all the days of her life. In her bitter words was the inherent revolt of the race of woman. But now she suddenly felt that she had flung him an infinite distance from her, that she had struck at the thing she most cherished, his belief that she loved him, that even if she had told the truth, and she felt she had not, it was not the truth she wished him most to feel. For an instant she stood looking at him, shocked and confounded. Then her changeless love rushed back on her, the maternal and protective spirit welled up, and with a passionate cry she threw herself into the chair again in very weakness, with outstretched hands, saying: "Forgive me, oh, forgive me! I did not mean it! Oh, forgive your Rosalie!" Stooping over her, he answered: "It is good for me to know the whole truth. What hurts you may give me will pass, for life must end, and my life cannot be long enough to pay the price of the hurts I have given you.
I could bear 1,000, one for every hour, if they could bring back the light to your eye, the joy to your heart. Could prayer, do you think, make me sorrier than I am? I have hurt what I would have spared from hurt at the cost of my life, and all the lives in the world," he added fiercely. "Forgive me, oh, forgive me, Rosalie!" she pleaded. "I did not know what I was saying. I was mad." "It was all so sane and true," he said, like one who, on the brink of death, finds a satisfaction in speaking the perfect truth. "I am glad to hear the truth. I have been such a liar." She looked up startled, her tears blinding her. "You have not deceived me?" she asked bitterly. "Oh, you have not deceived me! You have loved me, have you not?" It was that which mattered, that only. Moveless and eager she looked at him, waiting, as it were, for sentence. "I never lied to you, Rosalie. Never," he answered, and he touched her hand. She gave a moan of relief at his words. "Oh, then," she said in a low voice, and the tears in her eyes dried away, "I meant that until I knew you, I kept deceiving myself and others all my life." "But without knowing it?" she said eagerly. "Perhaps without quite knowing it." "Until you knew me?" she asked in quick, quavering tones. "Till I knew you," he answered. "Then I have done you good, not ill?" she asked with painful breathlessness. "The only good there may be in me is you, and you only," he said, and he choked something rising in his throat, seeing the greatness of her heart, her dear desire to have entered into his life to his own good. He would have said that there was no good in him at all, but that he wished to comfort her. A little cry of joy broke from her lips. "Oh, that!" she cried, with happy tears. "Won't you kiss me now?" she added softly. He clasped her in his arms, and though his eyes were dry, his heart wept tears of blood. Chapter 52. The Coming of Billy. Chaudiere had made, and lost, a reputation. The Passion Play in the valley had become known to a whole country, to the Cure's and the Seigneur's unavailing regret. They had meant to revive the great story for their own people and the Indians, a homely, beautiful object lesson in an Eden, like innocence and quiet and repose. But behold, the world had invaded them. The vanity of the Notary had undone them. He had written to the great papers of the province, telling of the advent of the play, and pilgrimages had been organized, and excursions had been made to the spot, where a simple people had achieved a crude but notable picture of the life and death of the hero of Christendom. The Cure viewed with consternation the invasion of their quiet. It was no longer his own Chaudiere, and when on a Sunday his dear people were jostled from the church to make room for strangers, his gentle eloquence seemed to forsake him, he spoke haltingly, and his intoning of the Mass lacked the old soothing simplicity. "Ah, my dear Seigneur," he said, on the Sunday before the playing was to end, "we have overshot the mark." The Seigneur nodded, and turned his head away. "There is an English play which says, 'I have shot mine arrow o'er the house and hurt my brother.' That's it, that's it. We began with religion, and we end with greed and pride and notoriety. What do we want of fame? The price is too high, Maurice. Fame is not good for the hearts and minds of simple folk." "It will soon be over." "I dread a sordid reaction." The Seigneur stood thinking for a moment. "I have an idea," he said at last. "Let us have these last days to ourselves. The mission ends next Saturday at 5 o'clock. We will announce that all strangers must leave the valley by Wednesday night. Then, during those last 3 days, while yet the influence of the play is on them, you can lead your own people back to the old quiet feelings." "My dear Maurice, it is worthy of you. It is the way. We will announce it to day. And see now, for those 3 days we will change the principals, lest those who have taken the part so long have lost the pious awe which should be upon them. We will put new people in their places. I will announce it at vespers presently. I have in my mind who should play the Christ and St. John and St. Peter. The men are not hard to find. But for Mary the Mother and Mary Magdalene." The eyes of the two men suddenly met. A look of understanding passed between them. "Will she do it?" said the Seigneur.
The Cure nodded. Pauline Dubois has heard the word. Go and sin no more. She will obey. Walking through the village as they talked, the Cure shrank back painfully several times, for voices of strangers singing festive songs rolled out upon the road. "Who can they be?" he said distressfully. Without a word the Seigneur went to the door of the inn whence the sounds proceeded, and, without knocking, entered. A moment afterwards the voices stopped, but broke out again, quieted, then once more broke out, and presently the Seigneur issued from the door, white with anger, 3 strangers behind him. All were intoxicated. One was violent. It was Billy Wantage, whom the years had not improved. He had arrived that day with 2 companions, an excursion of curiosity as an excuse for a spree. "What's the matter with you, old stick in the mud?" he shouted. "Mass is over, isn't it? Can't we have a little guzzle between prayers?" By this time a crowd had gathered, among them Filion Lacasse. At a motion from the Seigneur, and a whisper that went round quickly, a dozen habitants swiftly sprang on the 3 men, pinioned their arms, and carried them bodily to the pump by the tavern, held them under it, one by one, till each was soaked and sober. Then their horses and wagon were brought, and they were given 5 minutes to leave the village. With a devilish look in his eye, and drenched and furious, Billy was disposed to resist the command, but the faces around him were determined, and, muttering curses, the 3 drove away towards the next parish. Chapter 53. The Seigneur and the Cure have a suspicion. Presently the Seigneur and the Cure stood before the door of the tailor shop. The Cure was about to knock, when the Seigneur laid a hand upon his arm. "There is no use. He has been gone several days," he said. "Gone? Gone?" said the Cure. "I came to see him yesterday, and not finding him, I asked at the post office." And Rossignols' voice lowered. "He told Mrs. Flynn he was going into the hills, so Rosalie says." The Cure's face fell. "He went away also just before the play began. I almost fear that we will get no nearer. His mind prompts him to do good and not evil, and yet I have dreamed a good dream, Maurice, but I sometimes fear I have dreamed in vain." "Wait, wait!" M. Loisel looked towards the post office musingly. "I have thought sometimes that what man's prayers may not accomplish, a woman's love might do. But alas, what do we know of his past? Nothing. What do we know of his future? Nothing. What do we know of the human heart? Nothing, nothing." The Seigneur was astounded. The Cure's meaning was plain. "What do you mean?" he asked almost gruffly. "She, Rosalie, has changed. Changed." In his heart he dwelt sorrowfully upon the fact that she had not been to confession to him for many, many months. Since her father's death? Since her illness? Since she went to Montreal 7 months ago. Even while she was so ill these past weeks, she never asked for me. And when I came, if it is that her heart has gone out to the man, and his does not respond." "A good thing, too," said the other gloomily. "We don't know where he came from, and we do know that he is but a pagan." "Yet there she sits now, hour after hour, day after day, so changed." "She lost her father," urged M. Rossignol anxiously. "I know the grief of children. This is not such a grief. This is something more. But I cannot ask. If she were a sinner, but she is without fault. Have we not watched her grow up here, mirthful, brave, pure souled?" "Fitted for any station," interposed the Seigneur huskily. Presently he laid a hand upon the Cure's arm. "Shall I ask her again?" he said, breathing hard. "Do you think she has found out her mistake?" The Cure was so taken aback that at first he could not speak. When he realized, however, he could scarce suppress a smile at the other's simple vanity. But he mastered himself and said: "It is not that, Maurice. It is not you." "How did you know I had asked her?" asked his friend querulously. "You have just told me." M. Rossignol felt a kind of reproval in the Cure's tone. It made him a little nervous. "I'm an old fool, but she needed some one," he protested. "At least I am a gentleman, and she would not be thrown away." "Dear Maurice," said the Cure, and linked his arm in the other's. "In all respects save one, it would have been to her advantage.
But youth is the only comrade for youth. All else is evasion of life's laws." The Seigneur pressed his arm. "I thought you less worldly wise than myself. I find you more," he said. "Not worldly wise. Life is deeper than the world or worldly wisdom. Come, we will both go and see Rosalie." M. Rossignol suddenly stopped at the post office door, and half turned towards the tailor's shop. He is young. Suppose that he drew her love his way, but gave her nothing in return, and if it were so the Cure paused, and his face darkened. If it were so, he should leave her for ever, and so my dream would end. And Rosalie? Rosalie would forget. To remember, youth must see and touch and be near, else it wears itself out in excess of feeling. Youth feels more deeply than age, but it must bear daily witness. "Upon my honour, Cure, you shall write your little philosophies for the world," said M. Rossignol, and then knocked at the door. "I will go in alone, Maurice," the Cure urged. "Good, you are right," answered the other. "I will go write the proclamation denying strangers the valley after Wednesday. I will enforce it, too," he added, with vigour, and, turning, walked up the street, as Mrs. Flynn admitted the Cure to the post office. A half hour later M. Loisel again appeared at the post office door, a pale, beautiful face at his shoulder. He had not been brave enough to say what was on his mind, but as he bade her good bye, he plucked up needful courage. "Forgive me, Rosalie," he said, "but I have sometimes thought that you have more griefs than one. I have thought," he paused, and then went on bravely, "that there might be unwelcomed love, or love deceived." A mist came before her eyes, but she quietly and firmly answered: "I have never been deceived in love, Monsieur Loisel." "There, there," he hurriedly and gently rejoined. "Do not be hurt, my child. I only want to help you." A moment afterwards he was gone. As the door closed behind him, she drew herself proudly up. "I have never been deceived," she said aloud. "I love him, love him, love him." Chapter 53. Recording by Tom Weiss. Tom'sAudiobooks.com. Chapters 54 through 57 of The Right Away by Gilbert Parker. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss. Chapter 54. M. Rossignol slips the leash. It was the last day of the Passion Play, and the great dramatic mission was drawing to a close. The confidence of the Cure in the Seigneur was restored. The prohibition against strangers had had its effect, and for 3 whole days the valley had been at rest again. Apparently there was not a stranger within its borders, save the Seigneur's brother, the Abbe Rossignol, who had come to see the moving spectacle. The Abbe, on his arrival, had made inquiries concerning the tailor of Chaudiere and Jo Portugais, as persistently about the one as the other. Their secrets had been kept inviolate by him. It was disconcerting to hear the tales people told of the tailor's charity and wisdom. It was all dangerous, for what was, accidentally, no evil in this particular instance, might be the greatest disaster in another case. Principle was at stake. He heard in stern silence the Cure's happy statement that Jo Portugais had returned to the bosom of the Church, and attended Mass regularly. "So it may be, my dear Abbe," said M. Loisel, "that the friendship between him and our infidel has been the means of helping Portugais. I hope their friendship will go on unbroken for years and years." "I have no idea that it will," said the Abbe grimly. "That rope of friendship may snap untimely." "Upon my soul, you croak like a raven," testily broke in M. Rossignol, who was present. "I didn't know there was so much in common between you and my surly jowled groom. He gets his pleasure out of croaking. Wait, wait, you'll see, you'll see. Death, death, death. Every man must die. The devil has you by the hair. Death, death, death. Bah! I'm heartily sick of croakers. I suppose, like my grunting groom, you'll say about the Passion Play, no good will come of it. Wait, wait, wait. Bah!" "It may not be an unmixed good," answered the ascetic. "Well, and is there any such thing on earth as an unmixed good? The play yesterday was worth 1,000 sermons. It was meant to serve Holy Church, and it will serve it. Was there ever anything more real and touching than Paulette Dubois as Mary Magdalene yesterday? I do not approve of such reality. For that woman to play the part is to destroy the impersonality of the scene. You would demand that the Christus should be a good man, and the St. John blameless. Why shouldn't the Magdalene be a repentant woman? It might impress the people more if the best woman in your parish were to play the part. The fall of virtue, the ruin of innocence, would be vividly brought home. It does good to make the innocent feel the terror and shame of sin. That is the price the good pay for the fall of man, sorrow and shame for those who sin." The Seigneur, rising quickly from the table and kicking his chair back, said angrily, "Damn your theories!" Then, seeing the frozen look on his brother's face, continued more excitedly, "Yes, damn your theories! You always took the crass view. I beg your pardon, Cure. I beg your pardon." He then went to the window, threw it open, and called to his groom. "Here, there, Coffin Face," he said, "bring round the horses, the quietest one in the stable for my brother, you hear? He can't ride," he added maliciously. This was his fiercest stroke, for the Abbe's secret vanity was the belief that he looked well on a horse, and rode handsomely. Chapter 55. Rosalie Plays a Part. From a tree upon a little hill rang out a bell, a deep toned bell, bought by the parish years before for the missions held at this very spot. Every day it rang for an instant at the beginning of each of the 5 acts. It also tolled slowly when the curtain rose upon the scene of the crucifixion. In this act no one spoke save the abased Magdalene, who knelt at the foot of the cross, and on whose hair red drops fell when the Roman soldier pierced the side of the figure on the cross. This had been the Cure's idea. The Magdalene should speak for mankind, for the continuing world. She should speak for the broken and contrite heart in all ages, should be the first fruits of the sacrifice, a flower of the desert earth bedewed by the blood of the Prince of Peace. So, in the long nights of the late winter and early spring, the Cure had thought and thought upon what the woman should say from the foot of the cross. At last he put into her mouth that which told the whole story of redemption and deliverance, so far as his heart could conceive it, the prayer for all sorts and conditions of men, and the general thanksgiving of humanity. During the last 3 days, Paulette Dubois had taken the part of Mary Magdalene. As Jo Portugais had confessed to the Abbe that notable day in the woods at Vadrome Mountain, so she had confessed to the Cure after so many years of agony. And the one confession fitted into the other. Jo had once loved her. She had treated him vilely, then a man had wronged her, and Jo had avenged her. This was the tale in brief. She it was who laughed in the gallery of the court-room the day that Joseph Nadeau was acquitted. It had pained and shocked the Cure more than any he had ever heard, but he urged for her no penalty, as Portugais had set for himself with the austere approval of the Abbe. Paulette's presence as the Magdalene had had a deep effect upon the people, so that she shared with Mary the mother the painfully real interest of the vast audience. 5 times had the bell rung out in the perfect spring air, upon which the balm of the forest and the refreshment of the ardent sun were poured. The quick anger of M. Rossignol had passed away long before the Cure, the Abbe, and himself had reached the lake and the great plateau. Between the acts the 2 brothers walked up and down together, at peace once more, and there was a suspicious moisture in the Seigneur's eyes. The demeanour of the people had been so humble and rapt that the place and the plateau and the valley seemed alone in creation with the lofty drama of the ages. The Cure's eyes shone when he saw on a little knoll in the trees, apart from the worshippers and spectators, Charley and Jo Portugais. His cup of content was now full. He had felt convinced that if the tailor had but been within these bounds during the past 3 days, a work were begun which should end only at the altar of their parish church. Today the play became to him the engine of God for the saving of a man's soul. Not long before the last great tableau was to appear, he went to his own little tent near the hut where the actors prepared to go upon the stage. As he entered, some one came quickly forward from the shadow of the trees and touched him on the arm. "Rosalie!" he cried in amazement, for she wore the costume of Mary Magdalene. "It is I, not Paulette, who will appear," she said, a deep light in her eyes. "You, Rosalie?" he asked, dumbfounded. "You are distraught. Trouble and sorrow have put this in your mind. You must not do it." "Yes, I am going there," she said, pointing towards the great stage. "Paulette has given me these to wear," she touched the robe, "and I only ask your blessing now. Oh, believe me, I can speak for those who are innocent and those who are guilty, for those who pray and those who cannot pray, for those who confess and those who dare not. I can speak the words out of my heart with gladness and agony, Monsieur," she urged in a voice vibrating with feeling. A luminous look came into the Cure's face. A thought leapt up in his heart. Who could tell? This poor girl, speaking for the whole sinful, unbelieving and believing world, might be the one last conquering argument to the man. He could not read the agony of spirit which had driven Rosalie to this, to confess through the words of Mary Magdalene her own woe, to say it out to all the world, and to receive, as did Paulette Dubois, every day after the curtain came down, absolution and blessing. She longed for the old remembered peace. The Cure could not read the struggle between her love for a man and the ineradicable habit of her soul. But he raised his hand, made the sacred gesture over her, and said, "Go, my child, and God be with you." He could not see her for tears as she hurried away to where Paulette Dubois awaited her, the two at peace now. At the hands of the lately despised and injurious woman, Rosalie was made ready to play the part in the last act, none knowing save the few who appeared in the final tableau, and they at the last moment only. The bell began to toll. 1,000 people fell upon their knees, and with fascinated yet abashed and awe-struck eyes saw the great tableau of Christendom, the three crosses against the evening sky, the figure in the centre, the Roman populace, the trembling Jews, the pathetic groups of disciples. A cloud passed across the sky, the illusion grew, and hearts quivered in piteous sympathy. There was no music now, not a sound save the sob of some overwrought woman. The woe of an oppressed world absorbed them. Even stolid Indians, as Roman soldiers, shrank awe-stricken from the sacred tragedy. Now the eyes of all were upon the central figure. Then they shifted for a moment to John the Beloved, standing with the mother. "Pauvre mère, pauvre Christ!" said a weeping woman aloud. A Roman soldier raised a spear and pierced the side of the hero of the world. Blood flowed, and hundreds gasped. Then there was silence, a strange hush as of a prelude to some great event. "It is finished. Father, into thy hands I commend my spirit," said the figure. The hush was broken by such a sound as one hears in a forest when a wind quivers over the earth, flutters the leaves, and then sinks away, neither having come nor gone, but only lived and died. Again there was silence, and then all eyes were fixed upon the figure at the foot of the cross, Mary the Magdalene. Day after day they had seen this figure rise, come forward a step, and speak the epilogue to this moving miracle drama. For the last 3 days Paulette Dubois had turned a sorrowful face upon them, and with one hand upraised had spoken the prayer, the prophecy, the thanksgiving, the appeal of humanity and the ages. They looked to see the same figure now, and waited. But as the Magdalene turned, there was a great stir in the multitude, for the face bent upon them was that of Rosalie Evanturel. Awe and wonder moved the people. Apart from the crowd, under a clump of trees, knelt a woodsman from Vadrome Mountain, and the tailor of Chaudiere stood beside him. When Charley, touched by the heavy scene, saw the figure of the Magdalene rise, he felt a curious thrill of fascination. When she turned,
and he saw the face of Rosalie, the blood rushed to his face. Then his heart seemed to stand still. Pain and shame travelled to the farthest recesses of his nature. Jo Portugais rose to his feet with a startled exclamation. Rosalie began to speak. "This is the day of which the hours shall never cease. In it there shall be no night. He whom you have crucified hath saved you from the wrath to come. He has saved others, himself he would not save. Even for such as I, who have secretly opened, who have secretly entered, the doors of sin, with a gasp of horror and a mad desire to take her away from the sight of this gasping, fascinated crowd, Charley made to rush forward, but Jo Portugais held him back. "Be still, you will ruin her, M'sieu'," said Jo. "Even for such as I am," the beautiful voice went on, "hath he died. And in the ages to come, women such as I, and all women who sorrow, and all men who err and are deceived, and all the helpless world, will know that this was the friend of the human soul. Not a gesture, not a movement, only that slight, pathetic figure, with pale, agonized face, and eyes that looked beyond them, over their heads to the darkening east, the clouded light of the evening behind her. Her voice rang out now valiant and clear, now searching and piteous, yet reaching to where the farthermost person knelt, and was lost upon the lake and in the spreading trees. What ye have done may never be undone. What he hath said shall never be unsaid. His is the word which shall unite all languages, when ye that are Romans shall be no more Romans, and ye that are Jews shall still be Jews, reproached and alone. No longer shall men faint in the glare, the shadow of the cross shall screen them. No more shall women bear her black sorrows alone. The light of the world shall cheer her." As she spoke, the cloud drew back from the sunset, and the saffron glow behind lighted the cross and shone upon her hair, casting her face in a gracious shadow. Her voice rose higher. "I, the Magdalene, am the first fruits of this sacrifice. From the foot of this cross I come. I have sinned more than all. I have shamed all women. But I have confessed my sin. And he is faithful and just to forgive us our sins, and to cleanse us from all unrighteousness." Her voice now became lower, but clear and even, pathetically exulting. "O world, forgive, as he hath forgiven you. Fall, dark curtain, and hide this pain, and rise again upon forgiven sin and a redeemed people." She stood still, with her eyes upraised, and the curtain came slowly down. For a long time no one in all the gathered multitude stirred. Far over under the trees a man sat upon the ground, his head upon his arms, and his arms upon his knees, in a misery unmeasurable. Beside him stood a woodsman, who knew of no word to say that might comfort him. A girl in the garb of the Magdalene entered the tent of the Cure, and, speaking no word, knelt and received absolution of her sins. Chapter 56. Mrs. Flynn speaks. Charley left Jo Portugais behind, and went home alone. He watched at a window till he saw Rosalie return. As she passed quickly down the street with Mrs. Flynn to her own door, he observed that her face was happier than he had seen it for many a day. Her step was lighter, there was a freedom in her air, a sense of confidence in her carriage. She bore herself as one who had done a thing which relaxed a painful tension. There was a curious glow in her eyes and face, and this became deeper as, showing himself at the door, she saw him, smiled, and stood still. He came across the street and took her hand. "You have been away," she said softly. "For a few days," he answered. "Far?" "At Vadrome Mountain." "You have missed these last days of the Passion Play," she said, a shadow in her eyes. "I was present to day," he answered. She turned away her head quickly, for the look in his eyes told her more than any words could have done, and Mrs. Flynn said: "'Tis a day for everlastin' memory, sir. For the part she played this day, the darlin' only such as she could play. 'Tis the innocent taketh the shame o' the guilty, and the tears do be comin' to me eyes. 'Tis not ould Widdy Flynn's eyes alone that's wet this day, but hearts do be weepin' for the love of God." Rosalie suddenly opened the door, and without another look at Charley, entered the house. "'Tis one in a million," said Mrs. Flynn, in a confidential tone, for she had a fixed idea that Rosalie loved Charley, and that he loved her, and that the only thing that stood in the way of their marriage was religion. From the first Charley had conquered Mrs. Flynn. That he was a tailor was a pity and a shame, but love was love, and the man had a head on him and a heart in him, and love was love. So Mrs. Flynn said, "'Tis one that a man that's a man should do anythin' for, was it havin' the heart cut out of him, or givin' the last drop of his blood. Sure, for such as her, murder, or false witness, or givin' up the last wish, or thought a man hugged to his bosom, would be as aisy as easy." Charley laughed to himself. Her purpose was so obvious, but his heart went out to her, for she was a friend, and, whatever came to him, Rosalie would not be alone. "I believe every word of yours," he said, shaking her hand. "And we'll see, you and I, that no man marries her who isn't ready to do what you say." "Would you do it for yourself, if it was you?" she asked, flushing for her boldness. "I would," he answered. "Then do it," she said, and fled inside the house and shut the door. "Mrs. Flynn, good Mrs. Flynn," he said, and went back sadly to his house, and shut himself up with his thoughts. When night drew on he went to bed, but he could not sleep. He got up after a time, and taking pen and paper, wrote for a long time. Having finished, he took what he had written, and placing it with the 2 packets of money in pearls, which he had brought from his old home, he addressed it to the Cure, and going to the safe in the wall of the shop, placed them inside and locked the door. Then he went to bed and slept soundly, the deep sleep of the just. Chapter 57. A burning fiery furnace. Every man within the limits of the parish was in his bed, save one. He was a stranger who, once before, had visited Chaudiere for one brief day, when he had been saved from death at the Red Ravine, and had fled the village that night because, as he thought, he had heard the voice of his old friend's ghost in the trees. Since that time he had travelled in many parishes, healing where he could, entertaining where he might, earning money as the charlatan. He was now on his way back through the parishes to Montreal, and his route lay through Chaudiere. He had hoped to reach Chaudiere before nightfall. He remembered with fear the incident from which he had fled many months before. But his horse had broken its leg on a corduroy bridge a few miles out from the parish in the hills, and darkness came upon him before he could hide his wagon in the woods and proceed afoot to Chaudiere. He had shot his horse and rolled it into the swift torrent beneath the bridge. Travelling the lonely road, he drank freely from the whiskey horn he carried, to keep his spirits up, so that by the time he came to the outskirts of Chaudiere, he was in a state of intoxication, and reeled impudently along with the Dutch courage the liquor had given him. Arrived at the first cluster of houses in the place, he paused uncertain. Should he knock here, or go on to the tavern? He shivered at the thought of the tavern, for it was near it he had heard Charley Steele's voice calling to him out of the trees. If he knocked here, would the people admit him in his present state? He had sense enough to know that he was very drunk. As he shook his head in owlish gravity, he saw the church on the hill not far away. He chuckled to himself. The carpet in the chancel and the hassocks at the altar would make a good bed. No fear of Charley's ghost coming inside the church. It wouldn't be that kind of a ghost. As he travelled the intervening space, shrugging his shoulders, staggering serenely, he told himself in confidence that he would leave the church at dawn, go to the tavern, purchase a horse as soon as might be, and get back to his wagon. The church door was unlocked, and he entered and made his way to the chancel, found surplices in the vestry, and put a hassock inside one for a pillow. Then he sat down and drew the loose rug of the chancel floor over him, and took another drink from the whiskey horn. Lighting his pipe, he smoked for a while, but grew drowsy, and his pipe fell into his lap. With eyes nearly shut, he struck another match, made to light his pipe again, but threw the match away, still burning. As he did so, the pipe dropped again from his mouth, and he fell back on the hassock pillow he had made. The lighted match fell on a surplice which had dropped from his arms as he came from the vestry, and set it afire. In 5 minutes the whole chancel was burning, and the sleeping man waked in the midst of smoke and flame. He staggered to his feet with a terror-stricken cry, stumbled down the aisle, through the front door, and out into the night. Reaching the road, he turned his face again to the hill where his wagon lay hid. If he could reach that, he would be safe. Nobody would suspect him. He clutched the whiskey horn tight and broke into a run. As he passed beyond the village, his excited imagination heard Charley Steele's ghost calling after him. He ran harder. The voice kept calling from Chaudiere. Not Charley's voice, but the voices of many people in Chaudiere were calling. Some wakeful person had seen the glare in the church windows, and had given the alarm, and now there rang through the streets the call, "Fire! Fire! Fire!" Charley and Joe were among the last to wake, for both had slept soundly, but Joe was roused by a handful of gravel thrown at his window and a warning cry, and a few moments later he and Charley were in the street with a hurrying crowd. Over all the village was a red glare, lighting up the sky, burnishing the trees. The church was a mass of flames. Charley was as pale as the rest of the crowd, for he thought of the Cure, he thought of this people to whom their church meant more than home, and vastly more than friend and fortune. His heart was with them all, not because it was their church that was burning, but because it was something dear to them. Reaching the hill, he saw the Cure coming from the vestry of the burning church, bearing some vessels of the altar. Depositing them in the arms of his weeping sister, he turned again towards the door. People clung to him and would not let him go. "See, it is all in flames!" they cried. "Your cassock is singed. You shall not go!" At that moment Charley and Portugais came up. A hurried question to the Cure from Charley, a key handed over, a nod from Joe, and before the Cure could prevent them, the two men had rushed through the smoke and flame into the vestry, Portugais holding Charley's hand. The crowd outside waited in a terrible anxiety. The timbers of the chancel portion of the building seemed about to fall, and still the two men did not appear. The people called. The Cure clinched his hands at his side. He was too fearful even to pray. But now the two men appeared, loaded with the few treasures of the church. They were scorched and singed, and the beards of both were burned, but stumbling and exhausted, they brought their loads to the eager arms of the waiting habitants. Then from the other end of the church came a cry, "The little cross! The little iron cross!" Then another cry, "Rosalie Evanturel! Rosalie Evanturel!" Someone came running to the Cure. "Rosalie Evanturel has gone inside for the little cross on the pillar. She is in the flames. The door has fallen in. She can't get out again." With a hoarse cry, Charley darted back inside the vestry door. A cry of horror went up. It was only a minute and a half, but it seemed like years, and then a man in flames appeared in the fiery porch, and not alone. He carried a girl in his arms. He wavered even at the threshold with the timbers swaying overhead, but with a last effort he plunged forward through the furnace, and was caught by eager hands on the margin of endurable heat. The two were smothered in quilts brought from the Cure's house, and carried swiftly to the cool safety of the grass and trees beyond. The woman had fainted in the flame of the church. The man dropped insensible as they caught her from his arms. As they tore away Charley's coat muffling his face, and opened his shirt, they stared in awe. The cross which Rosalie had torn from the pillar, Charley had thrust into his bosom, and there it now lay on the red scar made by itself in the hands of Louis Trudel. M. Loisel waved the people back. He raised Charley's head. The Abbe Rossignol, who had just arrived with the Seigneur, lifted the cross from the insensible man's breast. He started when he saw the scar. Then he remembered the tale he had heard. He turned away gravely to his brother. "Was it the cross or the woman he went for?" he asked. "Great God, do you ask?" the Seigneur said indignantly. "And he deserves her.
he muttered under his breath.
Charley opened his eyes. "Is she safe?" he asked, starting up. "Unscathed, my son," the Cure said. Was this tailor man not his son? Had he not thirsted for his soul as a hart for the water brooks? "I am very sorry for you, Monsieur," said Charley. "It is God's will," was the reply in a choking voice. "It will be years before we have another church. Many, many years." The roof gave way with a crash, and the spire shot down into the flaming debris. The people groaned. "It will cost $60,000 to build it up again," said Filion Lacasse. "We have $3,000 from the Passion Play," said the Notary. "That could go towards it." "We have another $2,000 in the bank," said Maximilian Cour. "But it will take years," said the saddler disconsolately. Charley looked at the Cure, mournful and broken, but calm. He saw the Seigneur, gloomy and silent, standing apart. He saw the people in scattered groups, looking more homeless than if they had no homes. Some groups were silent, others discussed angrily the question, who was the incendiary? That it had been set on fire seemed certain. "I said no good would come of the play acting," said the Seigneur's groom, and was flung into the ditch by Filion Lacasse. Presently Charley staggered to his feet, purpose in his face. These people, from the Cure and Seigneur to the most ignorant habitant, were hopeless and inert. The pride of their lives was gone. "Gather the people together," he said to the Notary and Filion Lacasse. Then he turned to the Cure and the Seigneur. "With your permission, messieurs," he said, "I will do a harder thing than I have ever done. I will speak to them all." Wondering, M. Loisel added his voice to the Notary's, and the word went round. Slowly they all made their way to a spot the Cure indicated. Charley stood on the embankment above the road, the notables of the parish round him. Rosalie had been taken to the Cure's house. In that wild moment in the church, when she had fallen insensible in Charley's arms, a new feeling had sprung up in her. She loved him in every fibre, but she had a strange instinct, a prescience, that she was lying on his breast for the last time. She had wound her arms round his neck, and as his lips closed on hers she had cried, "We shall die together, together." As she lay in the Cure's house, she thought only of that moment. "What are they cheering for?" she asked, as a great noise came to her through the window. "Run and see," said the Cure's sister to Mrs. Flynn, and the fat woman hurried away. Rosalie raised herself so that she could look out of the window. "I can see him!" she cried. "See whom?" asked the Cure's sister. "Monsieur," she answered, with a changed voice. "He is speaking. They are cheering him." 10 minutes later the Cure and the Notary entered the room. M. Loisel came forward to Rosalie, and took her hands in his. "You should not have done it," he said. "I wanted to do something," she replied. "To get the cross for you seemed the only payment I could make for all your goodness to me." "It nearly cost you your life, and the life of another," he said, shaking his head reproachfully. Cheering came again from the burning church. "Why do they cheer?" she asked. "Why do they cheer? Because the man we have feared, Monsieur Mallard—" "I never feared him," said Rosalie, scarcely above her breath. "Because he has taught them the way to a new church again. And at once, my child." "A remarkable man," said Narcisse Dauphin. "There never was such a speech. Never in any court room was there such an appeal." "What did he do?" asked Mademoiselle Loisel, her hand in Rosalie's. "Everything," answered the Cure. There he stood in his tattered clothes, the beard burnt to his chin, his hands scorched, his eyes bloodshot, and he spoke. "With the tongues of men and angels," said M. Dauphin enthusiastically. The Cure frowned and continued. "You look on yonder burning walls," he said, "and wonder when they will rise again on this hill, made sacred by the burial of your beloved, by the christening of your children, the marriages which have given you happy homes, and the sacraments which are to you the laws of your life. You give 1/20th of your income yearly towards your church, then give 1/40th of all you possess today, and your church will be begun in a month. Before a year goes round you will come again to this venerable spot, and enter another church here. Your vows, your memories, and your hopes will be purged by fire. All that you possess will be consecrated by your free will offerings. Ah, if I could but remember what came afterwards! It was all eloquence, and generous, and noble thought." "He spoke of you," said the Notary. "He spoke the truth," and the people cheered. "He said that the man outside the walls could sometimes tell the besieged the way relief would come. Never again shall I hear such a speech." "What are they going to do?" asked Rosalie, and withdrew her trembling hand from that of Madame Dugal. "This very day, at my office, they will bring their offerings, and we will begin at once," answered M. Dauphin. "There is no man in Chaudiere but will take the stocking from the hole, the bag from the chest, the credit from the bank, the grain from the barn for the market, or make the note of hand to contribute 1/40th of all he is worth, for the rebuilding of the church." "Notes of hand are not money," said the Cure's sister, the practical sense ever uppermost. "They shall all be money, hard cash," said the Notary. "The Seigneur is going to open a sort of bank, and take up the notes of hand and give bank bills in return. To day I go with his steward to Quebec to get the money." "What does the Abbe Rossignol say?" said the Cure's sister. "Our church and parish are our own," interposed the Cure proudly. "We do our duty, and fear no abbe." "Voila!" said M. Dauphin. "He never can keep his hands off. I saw him go to Jo Portugais a little while ago. 'Remember?' he said. I can't make out what he was after. We have enough to remember to day, for sure." "Good may come of it, perhaps," said M. Loisel, looking sadly out upon the ruins of his church. "See, 'tis a sunrise," said Mrs. Flynn's voice from the corner, her face towards the eastern window. Chapter 57. Recording by Tom Weiss. Tom'sAudiobooks.com. Chapters 58 through the epilogue of The Right Away by Gilbert Parker. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss. Chapter 58. With his back to the wall. In 4 days, $10,000 in notes and gold had been brought to the office of the Notary by the faithful people of Chaudiere. All day in turn M. Loisel and M. Rossignol sat in the office and received that which represented 1/40th of the value of each man's goods, estate, and wealth, the 40th value of a wood sawyer's cottage or a widow's garden. They did it impartially for all, as the Cure and 3 of the best to do habitants had done for the Seigneur, whose $4,000 had been paid in first of all. Charley had been confined to his room for 3 days, because of his injuries and a feverish cold he had caught, and the habitants did not disturb his quiet. But Mrs. Flynn took him broth made by Rosalie's hands, and Rosalie fought with her desire to go to him and nurse him. She was not, however, the Rosalie of the old impulse and impetuous resolve. The arrow had gone too deep. She waited till she could see his face again, and look into his eyes. Not apathy, but a sense of the inevitable was upon her, and pale and fragile, but with a calm spirit, she waited for she knew not what. She felt that the day of fate was closing down. She must hold herself ready for the hour when he would need her most. At first, when the conviction had come to her that the end of all was near, she had revolted. She had had impulse to go to him at all hazards, to say to him, "Come away, anywhere, anywhere." But that had given place to the deeper thing in her, and something of Charley's spirit of stoic waiting had come upon her. She watched the people going to the Notary's office with their tributes and free will offerings, and they seemed like people in a play. These days she lived no life which was theirs. It was a dream, unimportant and temporary. She was feeling what was behind all life, and permanent. It could not last, but there it was, and she could not return to the transitory till this cloud of fate was lifted. She was much too young to suffer so, but the young ever suffer most. On the 4th day she saw Charley. He came from his shop and went to the Notary's office. At first she was startled, for he was clean shaven, The fire had burned his beard to the skin. She saw a different man, far removed from this life about them both, individual, singular. He was pale, and his eyeglass, with the clean-shaven face, gave an impression of refined separateness. She did not know that the same look was in both their faces. She watched him till he entered the Notary shop, then she was called away to her duties. Charley had come to give his 1/40th with the rest. When he entered the Notary's office, the Seigneur and M. Dauphin stood up to greet him. They congratulated him on his recovery, while feeling also that the change in his personal appearance somehow affected their relations. A crowd gathered round the door of the shop. When Charley made his offering, with a statement of his goods and income, the Seigneur and Notary did not know what to do. They were disposed to decline it, for since Monsieur was no Catholic, it was not his duty to help. At this moment of delicate anxiety, M. Loisel entered. With a swift, bright flush to his cheek, he saw the difficulty, and at once accepted freely. "God bless you," he said, as he took the money, and Charley left. "It shall build the doorway of my church." Later in the day, the Cure sent for Charley. There were grave matters to consider, and his counsel was greatly needed. They had all come to depend on the soundness of his judgment. It had never gone astray in Chaudiere, they said. They owed to him this extraordinary scheme, which would be an example to all modern Christianity. They told him so. He said nothing in reply. In an hour he had planned for them a scheme for the consideration of contractors, had drawn, with the help of M. Loisel, an architect's rough plan of the new church, and, his old professional instincts keenly alive, had lucidly suggested the terms and safeguards of the contracts. Then came the question of the money contributed. The day before, M. Dauphin and the Seigneur's steward had arrived in safety from Quebec with $20,000 in bank bills. These M. Rossignol had exchanged for the notes of hand of such of the habitants as had not ready cash to give. All of this $20,000 had been paid over. They had now $30,000 in cash, besides $3,000 which the Cure had at his house, the proceeds of the Passion Play. It was proposed to send this large sum to the bank in Quebec in another 2 days, when the whole contributions should be complete. As to the safety of the money, the timid M. Dauphin did not care to take responsibility. Strangers were still arriving, ignorant of the fact that the Passion Play had ceased, and some of them must be aware that this large sum of money was in the parish, no doubt also knew that it was in his house. It was therefore better, he urged, that M. Rossignol or the Cure should take charge of it. M. Loisel urged that secrecy as to the resting place of the money was important. It was better that it should be deposited in the most unlikely place, and with some unofficial person who might not be supposed to have it in charge. "I have it," said the Seigneur. "The money shall be placed in old Louis Trudel's safe in the wall of the tailor's shop." It was so arranged, after Charley's protests of unwillingness, and counter appeals from the others. That evening at sundown, $33,000 was deposited in the safe in the old stone wall of the tailor's shop, and the lock was sealed with the parish seal. But the Notary's wife had wormed the secret from her husband, and she found it hard to keep. She told it to Maximilian Cour, and he kept it. She told it to her cousin, the wife of Filion Lacasse, and she did not keep it. Before 24 hours went round, a dozen people knew it. The evening of the second day, another $2,000 was added to the treasure, and the lock was again sealed with the utmost secrecy. Charley and Jo Portugais, the infidel and the murderer, were thus the sentries to the peace of a parish, the bankers of its gifts, the security for the future of the Church of Chaudiere. Their weapons of defence were 2 old pistols belonging to the Seigneur. "Money is the master of the unexpected," the Seigneur had said as he handed them over. He chuckled for hours afterwards as he thought of his epigram. That night, as he turned over in bed for the 3rd time, as was his custom before going to sleep, another epigram came to him: "Money is the only fox hunted night and day." He kept repeating it over and over again with vain pride.
The truth of M. Rossignol's aphorisms had been demonstrated several days before. On his return from Quebec with the $20,000 of the Seigneur's money, M. Dauphin had dwelt with great pride on the discretion and energy he and the steward had shown, had told dramatically of the skill which had enabled them to make a journey of such importance so secretly in safety, had covered himself with blushes for his own coolness and intrepidity. Fortune had, however, favoured his reputation and his intrepidity, for he had been pursued from the hour he and his companion left Quebec. A taste for the picturesque had impelled him to arrange for 2 relays of horses, and this fact saved him and the $20,000 he carried. 2 hours after he had left Quebec, 4 determined men had got upon his trail, and had only been prevented from overtaking him by the freshness of the horses which his dramatic foresight had provided. The leader of these 4 pursuers was Billy Wantage, who had come to know of the curious action of the Seigneur of Chaudiere from an intimate friend, a clerk in the bank. Billy's fortunes were now in a bad way, and in desperate straits for money, he had planned this bold attempt at the highwayman's art with 2 gamblers to whom he owed money, and a certain notorious horse trader of whom he had made a companion of late. Having escaped punishment for a crime once before, through Charley's supposed death, the immunity nerved him to this later and more dangerous enterprise. The 4 rode as hard as their horses would permit, but M. Dauphin and his companion kept always an hour or more ahead, and from the high hills overlooking the village, Billy and his friends saw the 2 enter it safely in the light of evening. His 3 friends urged Billy to turn back, since they were out of provisions and had no shelter. It was unwise to go to a tavern or a farmer's house, where they must certainly be suspected. Billy, however, determined to make an effort to find the banking place of the money, and refused to turn back without a trial. He therefore proposed that they should separate, going different directions, secure accommodation for the night, rest the following day, and meet the next night at a point indicated. This was agreed upon, and they separated. When the 4 met again, Billy had nothing to communicate, as he had been taken ill during the night before, and had been unable to go secretly into Chaudiere village. They separated once more. When they met the next night, Billy was accompanied by an old confederate. As he was entering Chaudiere the previous evening, he had met John Brown, with his painted wagon and a new model horse. John Brown had news of importance to give, for in the stable yard of the village tavern he had heard one habitant confide to another that the money for the new church was kept in the safe of the tailor shop. John Brown was as ready to share it in Billy's second enterprise as he had been to incite him to his first crime. So it was that as the Seigneur made his epigram and gloated over it, the 5 men, with horses at a convenient distance, armed to the teeth, broke stealthily into Charley's house. They entered silently through the kitchen door, and made their way into the little hall. 2 stood guard at the foot of the stairs, and 3 crept into the shop. This night Jo Portugais was sleeping upstairs, while Charley lay upon the bench in the tailor shop. Charley heard the door open, heard unfamiliar steps, seized his pistol, and springing up with his back to the safe, called out loudly to Jo. As he dimly saw the men rush at him, he fired. The bullet reached its mark, and 1 man fell dead. At that moment a dark lantern was turned full on Charley, and a pistol was fired point blank at him. As he fell, shot through the breast, the man who had fired dropped the lantern with a shriek of terror. He had seen the ghost of his brother-in-law, Charley Steele. With a quaking cry of warning to others, Billy bolted from the house, followed by his companions, 2 of whom were struggling with Jo Portugais on the stairway. These now also broke and ran. Jo rushed into the shop, and saw, as he thought, Charley lying dead, saw the robber dead upon the floor. His master and friend gone, the conviction seized him that his own time had come. He would give himself to justice now, but to God's justice, not to man's. The robbers were 4 to 1, and he would avenge his master's death, and give his own life to do it. It was all the thought of a second. He rushed out after the robbers, shouting as he ran to awake the villagers. He heard the marauders ahead of him, and, fleet of foot, rushed on.
Reaching them as they mounted, he fired and brought down his man, a shivering quack doctor who, like his leader, had seen a sight in the tailor shop that struck terror to his soul. Two of the others then fired at Joe, who had caught a horse by the head. He fell without a sound and lay upon his face. He did not hear the hoofs of the escaping horses, nor any other sound. He had fallen without a pang beside the quack doctor, whose medicines would never again quicken a pulse in his own body or any other. Behind, in the village, frightened people flocked about the tailor shop. Within, Mrs. Flynn and the Notary crudely but tenderly bound up the dreadful wound in Charley's side, while Rosalie pillowed his head on her bosom. With a strange quietness, Rosalie gave orders to the Notary and Mrs. Flynn. There was a light in her eyes, an unnatural light, of strength and presence of mind. Her hand was steady, and as gently as a mother with a child, she wiped the moist forehead and poured a little brandy between the set teeth. "Stand back. Give him air," she said in a voice of authority to those who crowded round. People fell back in awe, for amid tears and excitement and fear this girl had a strange, convincing calm. By the time Charley's wound was stopped, messengers were on the way to the Cure and the Seigneur. By Rosalie's instructions, the dead body of the robber was removed, Charley's bed upstairs was prepared for him, a fire was lighted, and 20 hands were ready to do accurately her will. Now and again she felt his pulse, and she watched his face intently. In her bitter sorrow her heart had a sort of thankfulness, for his head was on her breast, he was in her arms. It had been given her once more to come first to his rescue, and with one wild cry, unheard by any one, to call out his beloved name. The world of Chaudiere, roused by the shooting, had then burst in upon them, but that one moment had been hers, no matter what came after. She had no illusions. She knew that the end was near, the end of all for him and for them both. The Cure entered and hurried forward. There was the seal of the parish intact on the door of the safe, but at what cost? "He has given his life for the Church," he said, then commanded all to leave save those needed to carry the wounded man upstairs. Still, it was Rosalie that directed the removal. She held his hand. She saw that he was carefully laid down. She raised his head to a proper height. She moistened his lips and fanned him. Meanwhile the Cure fell upon his knees, and the noise of talk and whispering ceased in the house. But presently there was loud murmuring and shuffling of feet outside again, and Rosalie left the room hurriedly and went below to stop it. She met the men who were bringing the body of Jo Portugais into the shop. Upstairs the Cure's voice prayed: "Of thy mercy, O Lord, hear our prayer. Grant that he be brought into thy church ere his last hour come. Forgive, O Lord." Charley stirred and opened his eyes. He saw the Cure bowed in prayer. He heard the trembling voice. He touched the white head with his hand. Chapter 58. Chapter 59, in which Charley meets a stranger. The Cure came to his feet with a joyful cry. "Monsieur, my son!" he said, bending over him. "Is it all over?" Charley asked calmly, almost cheerfully. Death now was the only solution of life's problems, and he welcomed it from the void. The Cure went to the door and locked it. The deepest desire of his life must here be uttered, his great aspiration be realized. "My son," he said, as he came softly to the bedside again, "you have given to us all you had, your charity, your wisdom, your skill. You have it was hard, but the man's wound was mortal, and it must be said you have consecrated our new church with your blood. You have given all to us. We will give all to you." There was a soft knocking at the door. He went and opened it, a very little. "He is conscious, Rosalie. Wait one moment." Then came the Seigneur's voice, saying that Jo was gone, and that all the robbers had escaped, save the two disposed of by Charley and Jo. The Cure turned to the bed once more. "What did he say about Jo?" Charley asked. "He is dead, my son, and the quack doctor also. The others have escaped." Charley turned his face away. "Au revoir, Jo," he said into the great distance. Then there was silence for a moment, while outside the door a girl prayed, with an old woman's arm around her. The Cure leaned over Charley again. "Shall not the sacraments of the Church comfort you in your last hours?" he said. "It is the way, the truth, and the life. It is the voice that says, 'Peace to the vexed mind.' Human intellect is vanity. Only the soul survives. Will you not hear the voice? Will you not give us who love and honor you the right to make you ours for ever? Will you not come to the bosom of that Church for which you have given all?" "Tell them so," Charley said, and he motioned towards the window, under which the people were gathered. With a glad exclamation, the Cure hastened to the window, and, in a voice of sorrowful exultation, spoke to the people below. Charley reckoned swiftly with his fate. What was there now to do? If his wound was not mortal, what tragedy might now come? For Billy's hand, the hand of Kathleen's brother, had brought him low. If the robbers and murderers were captured, he must be dragged into the old life, and to what an issue? All the old problems carried into more terrible conditions. And Rosalie, in his half consciousness he had felt her near him. He had felt her near him now. Rosalie, in any case, what could there be for her? Nothing. He had heard the Cure whisper her name at the door. She was outside, praying for him. He stretched out a hand as though he saw her, and his lips framed her name. In his weakness and fading life he had no anguish in the thought of her. Life and love were growing distant, though he loved her as few love and live. She would be removed from want by him. There were the pearls and the money in the safe with the money of the Church. There was a letter to the Cure, his last testament, leaving all to her. He, sleeping, would fear no foe. She, awake in the living world, would hold him in dear remembrance. Death were the better thing for all. Then Kathleen in her happiness would be at peace, and even Billy might go unmolested, for who was there to recognize Billy, now that Portugais was dead? He heard the Cure's voice at the window. "Oh, my dear people, God has given him to us at last. I go now to prepare him for his long journey. To" Charley realized and shuddered "receive the sacraments of the Church, be made ready by the priest for his going hence, and all the soul's interrogations with the solving of his own mortal problems? Say, 'I believe,' confess his sins, and receiving absolution, lie down in peace." He suddenly raised himself on his elbow, flinging his body over. The bandage of his wound was displaced, and blood gushed out upon the white cloths of the bed. "Rosalie!" he gasped. "Rosalie, my love! God keep—" As he sank back, he heard the priest's anguished voice above him, calling for help. He smiled. "Rosalie!" he whispered. The priest ran and unlocked the door, and Rosalie entered, followed by the Seigneur and Mrs. Flynn. "Quick, quick!" said the priest. The bandage slipped, or was it slipped? Who knows? Blind with agony, and as in a direful dream, Rosalie made her way to the bed. The sight of his ensanguined body roused her, and murmuring his name, continually murmuring his name, she assisted Mrs. Flynn to bind up the wound again. Standing where she stood when she had stayed Louis Trudel's arm long ago, with an infinite tenderness she touched the scar of the cross on his breast. Terrible as was her grief, her heart had its comfort in the thought, who could rob her of that for ever, that he would die a martyr. It did not matter now who knew the story of her love. It could not do him harm. She was ready to proclaim it to all the world. And those who watched knew that they were in the presence of a great human love. The priest made ready to receive the unconscious man into the church. Had Charley not said, "Tell them so"? Was it not now his duty to say the sacred offices over a son of the Church in his last bitter hour? So it was done, while he lay unconscious. For hours he lay still, and then the fevered blood, poisoned by the bullet which had brought him down, made him delirious, gave him hallucinations, open-eyed illusions. All the time Rosalie knelt at the foot of the bed, her piteous, tearless eye for ever fixed on his face. Towards evening, with an unnatural strength, he sat up in bed. "See," he whispered, "that woman in the corner there. She has come to take me, but I will not go." Fantasy after fantasy possessed him, fantasy strangely mixed with facts of his own past. Now it was Kathleen, now Billy, now Jo Portugais, now John Brown, now Suzanne Charlemagne at the Cote Dorion, again Jo Portugais. In strange, touching sentences he spoke to them, as though they were present before him. At length he stopped abruptly, and gazed straight before him, over the head of Rosalie, into the distance. "See," he said, pointing. "Who is that? Who? I can't see his face. It is covered. So tall, so white. He is opening his arms to me. He is coming closer, closer, closer. Who is it?" "It is Death, my son," said the priest in his ear, with a pitying gentleness. The Cure's voice seemed to calm the agitated sense, to bring it back to the outer precincts of understanding. There was an awestruck silence as the dying man fumbled over his breast, found his eyeglass, and, with a last feeble effort, raised it to his eye, shining now with an unearthly fire. The old interrogation of the soul, the elemental habit outlived all else in him. The idiosyncrasy of the mind automatically expressed itself. "I beg your pardon," he whispered to the imagined figure, and the light died out of his eyes. "Have I ever been introduced to you?" "At the hour of your birth, my son," said the priest, as a sobbing cry came from the foot of the bed. But Charley did not hear. His ears were forever closed to the voices of life and time. Chapter 60. The Hand at the Door. The eve of the day of the memorable funeral, two belated visitors to the Passion Play arrived in the village, unknowing that it had ended, and of the tragedy which had set a whole valley mourning, unconscious that they shared in the bitter fortunes of the tailor man, of whom men and women spoke with tears. Affected by the gloom of the place, the two visitors at once prepared for their return journey, but the manner of the tailor man's death arrested their sympathies, touched the humanity in them. The woman was much impressed. They asked to see the body of the man. They were taken to the door of the tailor shop while their horses were being brought round. Within the house itself they were met by an old Irishwoman, who, in response to their wish to see the brave man's body, showed them into a room where a man lay dead with a bullet through his heart. It was the body of Jo Portugais, whose master and friend lay in another room across the hallway. The lady turned back in disappointment. The dead man was little like a hero. The Irishwoman had meant to deceive her, for at this moment a girl who loved the tailor was kneeling beside his body, and, if possible, Mrs. Flynn would have no curious eyes look upon that scene. When the visitors came into the hall again, the man said, "There was another Kathleen, a woodsman." But standing by the nearly closed door, behind which lay the dead tailor of Chaudiere, they could see the holy candles flickering within. Kathleen whispered, "We've seen the tailor. That's enough. It's only the woodsman there. I prefer not, Tom." With his fingers at the latch, the man hesitated, even as Mrs. Flynn stepped apprehensively forward. Then, shrugging a shoulder, she responded to Kathleen's hand on his arm. They went down the stairs together, and out to their carriage. As they drove away, Kathleen said, "It's strange that men who do such fine things should look so commonplace." "The other one might have been more uncommon," he replied. "I wonder," she said, with a sigh of relief as they passed the bounds of the village. Then she caught herself flushing, for she suddenly realized that the exclamation was one so often on the lips of a dead, disgraced man, whose name she once had borne. If the door of the little room had opened to the fingers of the man beside her, the tailor of Chaudiere, though dead, would have been dearly avenged. Chapter 61. The Cure Speaks. The Cure stood with his back to the ruins of the church, at his feet two newly made graves, and all round with wistful faces crowds of reverent inhabitants. A benignant sorrow made his voice in perfect temper with the pensive striving of this latest day of spring. At the close of his address he said, "I owe you much, my people. I owe him more, for it was given him, who knew not God, to teach us how to know him better. For his past it is not given you to know. It is hidden in the bosom of the Church. Sinner he once was, criminal never, as one can testify who knows all." He turned to the Abbe Rossignol, who stood beside him, grave and compassionate, and his sins were forgiven him. He is the one sheaf which you and I may carry home rejoicing from the pagan world of unbelief. What he had in life he gave to us, and in death he leaves to our Church all that he has not left to a woman he loved, to Rosalie Evanturel. There was a gasping murmur among the people, but they stilled again, and strained to hear. He leaves her a little fortune, and to us all else he had. Let us pray for his soul, and let us comfort her who, loving deeply, reaped no harvest of love. The law may never reach his ruthless murderers, for there is none to recognize their faces, and were they 10 times punished, how should it avail us now? Let us always remember that in his grave our friend bears on his breast the little iron cross we held so dear. That is all we could give, our dearest treasure. I pray God that, scarring his breast in life, it may heal all his woes in death, and be a saving image on his bosom in the presence at the last." He raised his hands in benediction. Chapter 61. Epilogue. Never again was there a passion play in the Chaudiere valley. Springtimes and harvests and long winters came and went, and a blessing seemed to be upon the valley, for men prospered, and no untoward things befell the people. So it was for 20 years, wherein there had been coming and going in quiet. Some had gone upon short mortal journeys and had come back, some upon long immortal journeys and had never returned. Of the last were the Seigneur and a woman once a Magdalene, but in a house beside a beautiful church, with a noble doorway, lived the Cure, M. Loisel, aged and serene. There never was a day, come rain or shine, in which he was not visited by a beautiful woman whose life was one with the people of the valley. There was no sorrow in the parish which the lady did not share, with the help of an old Irishwoman called Mrs. Flynn. Was there sickness in the parish, her hands smoothed the pillow and soothed the pain. Was there trouble anywhere, her face brought light to the doorway. Did any suffer ill repute, her word helped to restore the ruined name. They did not know that she forgave so much in all the world, because she thought she had so much in herself to forgive. She was ever called Madame Rosalie, and she cherished the name, and gave commands that when her grave came to be made near to a certain other grave, Madame Rosalie should be carved upon the stone. Cheerfulness and serenity were ever with her, undisturbed by wish to probe the mystery of the life which had once absorbed her own. She never sought to know whence the man came. It was sufficient to know whither he had gone, and that he had been hers for a brief dream of life. It was better to have lived the one short thrilling hour with all its pain, than never to have known what she knew or felt what she had felt. The mystery deepened her romance, and she was even glad that the ruffians who slew him were never brought to justice. To her mind they were but part of the mystic machinery of fate. For her the years had given many compensations, and so she told the Cure one midsummer day, when she brought to visit him the orphan son of Paulette Dubois, graduated from college in France and making ready to go to the Far East. "I have had more than I deserved, 1,000 times," she said. The Cure smiled and laid a gentle hand upon her own. "It is right for you to think so," he said. "But after a long life I am ready to say that one way or another we earn all the real happiness we have. I mean the real happiness, the moments, my child. I once had a moment full of happiness." "May I ask?" she said. "When my heart first went out to him, he turned his face towards the churchyard. He was a great man," she said proudly. The Cure looked at her benignly. She was a woman, and she had loved a man. He had, however, come to a stage of life where greatness alone seemed of little moment. He forbore to answer her, but he pressed her hand. This is the end of The Right Away, by Gilbert Parker. Recording by Tom Weiss, Tom'sAudiobooks.com.